Welcome back, Notre Dame fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That's Ryan Roberts. I'm Brian Driscoll. It's draft day, Ryan. I got that. I'm fired up today, man. I'm excited about the NFL draft. I know you're excited about the NFL draft. So we're going to have some fun. Today is going to be a draft-centric day. We're going to talk about the Notre Dame players getting ready for the draft. We'll go over Ryan's. Ryan has a 7-round mock draft. We'll go over that. We'll talk about just kind of round one tonight, have some fun with that a little bit. And then we'll finish it up by talking about Notre Dame's recruiting over the years and which classes have had the best success. And then as long as we have time, Ryan and I will discuss, could that potentially be changing as we look forward, Ryan? And some very surprising stats there. But Mr. Roberts, man, it's that day. This is like Christmas. I know this is kind of like Christmas for you, right? Christmas morning for you, waking up and it's draft day.
I actually had 2 people text me today and say Merry Christmas, and I was just like, "All right, guys, I get it. It's draft day. We're there." It's always a busy day, though, man. And for whatever reason, all the agents I know wait until the day of the draft to call me and be like, "Hey, man, can you give me some insight into this class?" I'm like, "You should know this like 6 weeks ago at this point. I don't know why you're calling me right now, but yeah, man, it's always fun. I always like it just because it's." I mean, one, it's like, you do all the evaluations, all the film work, and it's just kind of like now just figuring out how the landscape figures itself out. But honestly, for me, the most fun part of the draft process is when you're done all the work and you just start laughing because people are freaking out about the rumor mills and the smoke screen season and everything that's involved there. I mean, I'm hearing people talking about Michael Penix and how high he's going to go, and now the New England trading out and who's trading up for a quarterback and all that chaos is always the fun part.
And we are going to have lots of conversation about that, Ryan, in part 2 of today's show. But part 1, we're going to talk about Notre Dame. And one of the most boring, and it's kind of got a little bit interesting the last couple days. And I like that your mock draft didn't just go with everyone else is projecting him here. Let's go there. So we'll talk about all the Notre Dame guys. We'll kind of go player by player. You had all 8 of the guys that we think have a chance to get drafted. Yep. You have all of them being picked. So we'll go over that, and I'll kind of mention that as we kind of go through it. So we'll talk about that part of your mock draft during the first section. But the one no-brainer, Ryan, is that Joe Alt is going to go in round 1 tonight. So we'll kick off our draft coverage talking about Joe Alt. And, just first of all, Ryan, Notre Dame went through a stretch of 3 years and actually it was like more 10 years, but 3 straight left tackles got drafted in the first round. Yep. Liam Eichenberg was broke the streak. He got picked 42nd overall, which is like 10 spots out of the first round to the Dolphins. And now Joe Alt has kicked that streak back live again, that first round left tackle thing. But now Notre Dame's last 5 offensive tackles and 6 of their last 7, if you want to go back to Ryan Harris, 6 of their last 7 left tackles, or actually 6 of their last 8, because there's that one weird 2017 season with who was, I think, Paul Duncan was the left tackle, right, that year. 6 of the last 8 have been drafted. And then 4 of the last 5, Ryan, have been first-round draft, or 3 of the last 4 have been first-round draft picks. And obviously, we expect Joe Alt to continue that strong stretch tonight.
Well, I think left tackle at Notre Dame has kind of become, what people were kind of phrasing as like Lincoln Riley quarterback for a few years, because he just kept having first-round pick after first-round pick, and I think that he kind of became synonymous with, highly drafted quarterbacks for obvious reasons. But I think Notre Dame it's kind of been that standard for a longer, obviously, stretch than that. But it means something to be the left tackle at Notre Dame. I mean, we're in a year now coming up where you're going to have a true sophomore left tackle in Charles Jagasaw, or a second-year player in Charles Jagasaw. And I think he already does understand, but he needs to understand, and any future left tackle at Notre Dame needs to understand that, like, that tradition is big, man. Like, that matters so much. And I would even take it one step further, Brian. I know that, obviously you're not saying that this isn't going to happen, obviously, but Joe Alt is not only just a first-round pick, but he's going to be a top 10 pick, obviously, right? So we talk about Ronnie Stanley being a top 10 pick. Mike McGlinchey was a top 10 pick. So Notre Dame's had a lot of success in the top 10 with left tackles, too, in the recency, the last 10 years or so. And I think that he's obviously going to continue that strong stretch because he's just one of those guys that we can overthink it if we want, But at the end of the day, the draft process is a resume process, and he's just kind of checked every single box. Like there really isn't a box that he doesn't check other than, maybe being a little bit more physical at times. But like even there, we can improve that with some added time in the strength and conditioning program and just some coaching. Like
because you said he's one of the younger left offensive tackles in this draft class, right? And he's like second or third youngest, or
I think I'm right about this. I think the two youngest offensive tackles in this class are Blake Fisher and Joe Alt. I'm pretty sure. Like I think Blake Fisher's the youngest.
They're both true juniors.
Yes.
I mean, you don't see that a ton.
Because I think Joe just turned 21 in February, so like he's super duper young. Like he's very young, and Blake is 2 months younger than him as well. So I think he just turned 21 also. So yeah, man, these guys are very young. Joe Alt, obviously talking about him. It's been a crazy maturation process from a guy that was viewed as a developmental guy, sort of. He has to grow into his body, and he's got to learn the fundamentals of playing offensive tackle, and then to look at him as a 3-and-done guy that's going to go in the top 10 picks. It's pretty wild to see the ascension that he's had.
Ryan, when you look at Joe Alt, obviously you said he's a first round. You see he's a top 10 pick. I've only seen like 2 or 3 mock drafts, and I've probably looked at 50 that I had him going outside the top 10. Those were ones that it just looked like that person was trying to be a little different, which right. I understand, because convention is not often followed in the NFL draft. And it is a very strong offensive tackle class, but most have him going in the top 10. What's interesting is I've actually seen some that have him going as high as number 5. Yep. And that's the interesting thing, because he is in a position to become, that guy that ends up going higher than Quentin Nelson and Micah McGlynn and Ronnie Stanley, who both went 6th. So he does have a chance to kind of put his stamp on it. I'm actually, while you're responding to that, what kind of that range where you see him, that's going to be my kick in the tee, that range that you see him. I'm actually going to go through, because I can't tell you the last time Notre Dame had a offensive lineman drafted higher than 6. So I'm going to go look that up now. But just where do you see the range tonight for Joe Alt? Will be part 1 of kind of where we see things going for him tonight.
Right. Well, I think the 5 to 7 bubble is kind of where I think it's most likely. And you talk about the Los Angeles Chargers at 5. The New York Giants, I think, are going to potentially be in the quarterback market, but even them at 6, I think they could be in the offensive tackle market, because Evan Neal has not been good for them so far. And I think there's a thought that if you draft a guy like Joe Alt, if he's on the board at 6, you can move Evan Neal into guard, which he played at Alabama and played pretty well at Alabama. And then you have your 3 out of 5 of your I also drafted John Michael Schmitz last year. So you got 4 out of 5 of stalwarts on your line potentially moving forward. But then number 7 to Tennessee is just like the easy one, right? Because right now they have Nicholas Petit-Frere and Dylan Radins projected to start at offensive tackle going into 2024. They could potentially double dip in this class. I mean, they could do what Seattle did a couple years ago, where they drafted Charles Cross in the first round. They came back and drafted Abraham Lucas out of Washington State in the second. Like, I could see something like that happening from Tennessee. So I think the most likely outcome is 5 to 7 as a bubble. I think absolute worst case scenario, and again, I don't think this is going to happen, but absolute worst case scenario is he drops to number 9 and the Chicago Bears decide to draft him. Like, that's, I think, the worst case scenario, because if he does drop, that means that we probably had an earlier run on wide receivers than we thought, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. Yeah, maybe people start saying Harrison goes 4, and people thinking I got to get up to 6 and 7 and 8 if I want to get Neighbors or a Dunze kind of thing. Yeah, right. I agree on that.
I think that bubble is 5 to 7, because even if in what Daniel Jeremiah and somebody else predicted J.C. Latham to be the 5th overall selection of the Chargers, even if that happens, Tennessee's going to take Joe Alt. Like, it is the worst kept secret in the NFL right now that the Tennessee Titans are going to draft an offensive tackle for one, and the other part is that they're pretty infatuated with Joe Alt.
Ryan, here's the other part that I was looking up for you. The last time Notre Dame had an offensive lineman go higher than 6th, which is where Quentin Nelson and Ronnie Stanley went 2 years apart, was 1969, and George Kuntz was taken with the number 2 overall pick. So you've got to go back to the Parsegian era, right? No pun intended, to have an offensive lineman for Notre Dame taken to the top 5, which is really fascinating when you consider how good offensive line play has been for Notre Dame. But a lot of their, there's been a lot of guys picked, but that would be the highest that they've seen at number 5. Now, let me ask you this question.
Funny enough, before the question is that my comp for Joe Alt was actually George Kuntz, so it makes total sense.
Well played, Ryan. Well played.
Like,
if he goes fifth,
yep.
do you think it's the Chargers taking him and moving him the right tackle, or do you think him at 5 or 6? Because this plays into your mock draft because you actually have him going 6th, but I believe you have him going 6th in a trade, correct? Where the Giants move up a spot to number 5 to take Drake May because you have some interesting stuff going on. You have the Vikings trading up to 3 to take JJ McCarthy. We'll get into that. Which then, if that happens, that sets off sort of, I think, what you're predicting, which is people are saying, how can we get up to get there? So then you have the Giants trading up a spot with the Chargers, so them just flipping spots, and then you actually have the Chargers taking Joe Alt at 6. I've seen some people have the Chargers actually take Joe Alt at 5. Do you think there could be a scenario where the Chargers are kind of maybe putting out that we're interested in linemen or whatever, and to say, hey, look, we're open for business. If you want to get ahead of the Titans to get Joe Alt, we're open for business? Or do you think that they're genuinely like, hey, they could take him, put him at right tackle, and stick him with Rashawn Slater?
So like the J.C. Latham stuff is very interesting of the rumors that we're hearing because – one, the main driver of that is obviously Daniel Jeremiah, who is very well connected in the NFL. But you have to understand with the being well connected in the NFL is that sometimes things are put out there because they know that you're
their pawn.
Right.
Yeah.
And he worked with the Chargers, different general manager regime, but still same ownership, obviously. And I am not discounting the fact, and this is no shot at Daniel Jeremiah, that he is a guy that's being used to put information out there because right now it's kind of been assumed that Joe Alt's going to be offensive tackle 1. He's going to be the first guy taken. So nobody's trading up because that's just kind of been the general state. But if they start thinking, if a team that's picking in the 10 to 20 range that really likes JC Latham, now you start throwing those breadcrumbs of like, hey, man, we might take him at 5. That's where interest starts being generated a little bit, right? Like, no, we have to get up to make sure that we get JC Latham, make sure that he doesn't get out of the top 10 because we know Joe Alt's going to go in the top 7 more than likely. Talisi Fuaga is a guy that the New York Jets could very well take at number 10 as well. So if that run's going to start with someone other than Joe Alt, that's not something that we were counting for, right? So I think that is those. It could just be breadcrumbs out there. I'm not necessarily buying that JC will be the first offensive tackle off the board. I will say this, though. The interesting thing about the Chargers and Latham compared to Alt is we know what Jim Harbaugh likes to do as an offensive coach. Likes to run the football a lot, right? He's a downhill running attack. And JC does fit that a little better than Joe. Now, Joe is a true tackle. Like, he can pass set, he can 45, he can vertical set. He's going to be a much better pass protector than JC Latham. But if you're asking a guy to just kick butt and run the ball 60% of the time, it's kind of a JC thing, right? Like, he makes a little bit more sense in that vein. But I do think that there's a little bit of breadcrumbs that's being thrown out there. And I do think the Chargers would be interested in Alts because, look, the left tackle versus right tackle thing, right? Joe Alt was a tight end in high school, and he figured out the left tackle thing pretty dang quick. Did he not? Yeah. He could figure out how to play in a right-handed stance. It's a transition.
We have seen him. We've actually seen him at Notre Dame playing a right-handed stance because his first playing time as a freshman was with number 45 on playing tight end.
Sure.
And he would play on both sides. And so we've seen
him
get in.
They ran some unbalanced stuff too the last couple of years where he was playing right tackle or playing tight end, I guess.
He would not only be right-handed, Ryan, but he would be right-handed with his hand in the ground. Yep. Which is even more challenging in that particular instance. So, yeah, we've seen that. So when you look at Joe Alt, Ryan, you talk about Daniel Jeremiah. I don't want to bang on it too much, but, like last year he had Will Levis going 4th to the Colts.
And that was another smoke screen.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what he said. There's a lot of smoke connecting Levis to the Colts. And who was putting that out? The Colts. Why? Because they wanted to make sure their guy fell to them. You know what I mean? So, why let any – like, I remember Mike Shanahan when he drafted Jay Cutler. The story coming out after that was they never spoke to Jay Cutler. They never interviewed Jay Cutler. They never did it because he was their guy, and they didn't want to do anything to make anyone think that he was their guy, and then they leap him and then take him.
Well,
So there's some of that too.
that's the funniest part every year, because some of the main traffic drivers in draft season for people that cover it is who's taking top 30 visits where. And I always just find it so funny because I'm like, guys, that usually means that they're not going to draft that guy more than anything. Like, usually that's where the smoke comes from. Like, oh man, we keep meeting with this guy. And then all of a sudden they draft somebody else that they didn't even know that you were connected to, right? Like, the connecting of the dots is very, and because you hear it every single year with a lot of guys, like, I barely talk to them. Maybe I met them in an informal interview at the Senior Bowl.
Talk to a guy at the combine for,
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ryan, let me ask you this question before we move on to the rest of the draft class. Who could be some dark horse teams that say, hey, we are looking for a left tackle to be our franchise left tackle that you could see maybe moving up a couple spots or trying to leap up to say they covet Joe Alt? Not that they necessarily covet Joe Alt per se, but more so that are definitely looking in at that left tackle range that you think have the ammunition. Because this is the thing. The Broncos could say, hey, we would love to move up to number 3 and take Drake May. But you can say you want to do that, but you don't have the ammunition to do that. You don't have the picks to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And so what are some teams that you could see say, hey, keep an eye on this team maybe making a move up for a left tackle, which could mean Joe Alt or could mean someone else if Joe Alt's off the board. But who are some teams you could see jockeying for that?
So I think that a couple of smaller jumps, I already mentioned one of them, but the Chicago Bears would not shock me, right? Like, wide receiver's been associated with them a lot, and I think that they could use one, but they do have DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. So, I mean, like a second round wide receiver, or I know they have limited picks, but like the next pick at wide receiver, you're going to get a pretty dang good wide receiver throughout most of this draft, potentially. And you really don't only need a guy that's a secondary pass catcher, because DJ Moore is going to be a high volume guy. Keenan Allen's a high volume guy. And I know Keenan Allen only has 1 year on his contract, but I mean, we can figure that stuff out as we kind of go, right? So I think Chicago's one.
And they have a couple good pass catchers at tight end because they have Everett and Cole Kmet. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think they are an interesting one. I think the New York Jets are a very interesting one. Again, a lot of people have talked about tackle and wide receiver for the Jets. Right now they have Tyron Smith, who is very injury prone at left tackle. Came over from the Cowboys. And right tackle.
He's also very old.
Yes. And they signed Morgan Moses as a right tackle, but Morgan Moses is also banged up a lot and also old. So I think getting a guy like that could potentially make some sense. A couple big jumps, and I wouldn't never discount jumps, because let's say Joe Alt gets to like 8 or 9 in some weird fall, right? And maybe a couple teams out there. One is the New Orleans Saints at 14, who desperately need offensive tackles. I mean, Trevor Penning's been a bust at left tackle so far. Ryan Ramczyk, who knows if he's going to be able to play or how long he's going to be able to play coming off the injury. They're one. Pittsburgh Steelers at 20 or another team that's an interesting one. The Cincinnati Bengals at 18. All those teams need offensive tackle, because I don't know if you know this, Brian. Offensive line play in the NFL is pretty bad, man. Like, it's not great. It's not great. Well,
I mean, just watching the Super Bowl, Ryan, and I'm watching the Kansas City Chiefs, and I'm thinking this is the best team in the NFL, and this is what their offensive line looks like. Like, and I think that's where, where I know the NFL likes a lot of the scheme stuff that college football is doing, but what we're seeing is there's not as many Harry he stands as there used to be. Right. Where you've got those coaches that value teaching guys how to play the game and technique and toughness. It's so scheme driven now.
Yes.
That the guys that end up being good are the guys that are just kind of the physical freaks, or the guys that, Penei Sewell, he was a physical freak, but I believe he played for Alex Mirabel, correct, at Oregon, I believe. Well, that's one of those guys that's still there. You see the job he's doing at Miami. You see guys like, Ronnie Stanley and guys like that. And you're seeing a lot of these guys at Bama in recent years are going to the NFL and not panning out. And you're seeing these guys from Auburn go to the NFL and not pan out, because there's these teams that are so scheme heavy. They're going away from the stuff that makes offensive linemen good. Because, like, look, I don't care what your scheme is. When you get in the NFL, you're going against the best of the best pass rushers. And
technique matters.
Exactly. You're going to get exposed if you're technique matters, timing, all that stuff. You got to be smart too. So it's going to be interesting. Let's keep rocking and rolling, Ryan, with Notre Dame players. And I'm actually going to follow the format or the order that you have for your mock draft, because you have Cam Hart being taken in the second round by the Baltimore Ravens, which would mean that the Ravens will now have Cam Hart and Kyle Hamilton as part of their secondary, which would give the Ravens one of the tallest secondaries in the NFL, that's for sure.
Yep.
But let's talk about Cam Ryan. Obviously, seems like from everything you've heard, I've heard, he's passed all the medical stuff with flying colors. And so I was actually told that by somebody close to Cam around the combine, that he went down there and everything checked out. No lingering issues, because they'll check and see if there's like a lot of scar tissue there. Is there like weakness in that thing to say, hey, this is something that's going to go bad. Right. He passed all that with flying colors, which has really helped. And he went through a period where there's a lot of buzz about him for a while, and that's kind of faded. And I wonder if part of that is intentional. Like, let's stop talking about Cam because, we want to get him. So let's talk about Cam, Ryan. Sure. You have him as a second-round pick, which would be, in my opinion, huge for Notre Dame because it's been a while since they've had a cornerback taken that high.
Well, it came down to with the fit with the Baltimore Ravens, because I know it's a fun fit, one, because I think Kyle and Cam have spoken very openly about being best friends, right? So like they have that relationship, obviously. I don't know if Kyle has the pull yet in the room to be like, hey, my guy's good, like get him down to Baltimore. I don't know if he has that pull yet. But it comes down to scheme fit for me. And when I think Baltimore Ravens, I think of Cam Hart, like just makes so much sense, man. Like you think of the players that have been good there, like the Jimmy Smiths who have been 6'2", Marlon Humphrey, who's a big physical corner. Like they like length in the secondary there. And so at the end of the second round, I thought that the fit just made too much sense at that point because there were a couple other good corners on the board, but they're like smaller guys where I'm just like, I don't know if that would be a Baltimore Raven fit at that point. Like, I just don't know if
you see most of those taller guys getting picked a lot earlier than that. You have Kool-Aid going earlier than that. You have the kid from Toledo going earlier than that.
Yep.
So yeah, a lot. I think, do you have the kid from Oregon going higher than Cam?
No, he was a couple spots behind.
So he'd be the only one that's it's him. Yeah, I see that now. Yeah, you got him at 64 to the Chiefs. So those are really the last couple big corners left on the board, to your point. So, and you talk about that, Ryan. Let's just kind of talk about how that would impact Notre Dame a little bit. We're going to kind of deviate from how we'll normally do this because, the point that I'm making is Notre Dame's had some first-round defensive backs taken in the last 10 years. Harrison Smith was obviously taken in the first round in 2012. Kyle Hamilton was taken in the first round in 2022. But it's been a long time, a very, very long time since Notre Dame has had a cornerback taken in the second round, much less the first round. Not since 1994 with Jeff Burris has Notre Dame actually. It's actually incorrect because I count Bobby Taylor as a safety because he was drafted to play safety, correct, with the Eagles, if I remember correctly.
I believe so. Yep. So
you could count Bobby Taylor because he played some corner at Notre Dame, but that's 1995. So 94, 95, either, actually Burris was actually a cornerback too in 1994. So actually you'd have to go back to Tom Carter in 1993, the last time a pure corner was taken in the first round or second round of the NFL draft by Notre Dame. So this would certainly be a step in the right direction for the Irish. There's no doubt about it.
I mean, a massive step, right? And I think it's really cool too because Cam was and everyone knows the background on this channel, obviously, but I think people around that are just national people and cover the NFL and stuff are kind of starting to learn this. So wide receiver recruits, right? Like a 3-star wide receiver coming out of good counsel. And I think that that's a very interesting conversation because like if I would think of it like this, Brian, if we're talking about like the recruiting impact implied in here too, is that if you look at Mike Mickens, right, as a cornerback recruit and be like, you took a 3-star, and I know he was a 4-star by one platform, but a 3-star majority rated player who was a wide receiver, mostly coming out of good counsel, and you turned him into a top 64 player. That's wild, man. That's wild development. And a guy that also, when he was taking making his transition originally, it was during COVID where that kind of messed up his transition.
That's what I was going to say, Ryan. Yeah. That's a great point because his first year he played receiver at Notre Dame. His first year. His second year, he was making the transition to corner. They had the COVID year, and he lost a whole offseason of development because they canceled spring ball after like a couple practices. Right. And then, of course, you had the weird stuff. I mean, so he really didn't start playing corner with the development that you normally get as a corner in the coaching and the time with the staff and all this stuff really until 2020 fall camp. Right. Really. And then his first true offseason playing corner wasn't until 2021. So to your point, this is a kid that is not a typical fifth-year corner because normally when I see a fifth-year corner, I'm like, well, there's a reason that cornerback was in college for 5 years. Cam's
Right.
a little bit of a unique player in that regard. And he's also going to, here's the other thing too, Ryan, he's going to check a lot of boxes from a character standpoint. That's the other thing is like, if I'm going to take a chance on a couple kids, am I taking the chance that stayed at Notre Dame, a kid that stayed at Notre Dame for 5 years, overcame what he overcame, battled through some injuries, was a captain his senior season, so yeah, I think that's going to help him as well. But it's going to be very interesting to see how Cam projects here for moving forward.
It's going to make the track a lot easier, man, because we're going to be talking about this all off season about, if Benjamin Morrison has another nice year, he's probably a 3-and-done kid and maybe goes in the first round potentially. He has that type of upside to him, obviously. And if that happens, then you're saying great development and also a shorter track too, as well. Like I don't have to stay here 4 or 5 years of development in a unique situation. I can go to Notre Dame, play early, and then potentially be a 3-and-done because I have such a good developmental track with what Mike Mickens is doing at the cornerback position.
We'll talk about this more in detail later, Ryan. Yep. But there's a chance that Notre Dame could have back-to-back first-round draft picks, a corner of guys that leave early. There's a chance. I'm not predicting it, but there's a chance with Christian Gray. And I think Jaden Mickey's got a chance to be an NFL football player as well in some capacity. Maybe a Julian Love type of track. But that matters when you're recruiting Dallas Golden and Tristan Haynes, who you had an update on today on the message board, and then we put a story about it. He said his official visit. That stuff matters. We've said it for years. That stuff matters. That's why Notre Dame can recruit anyone on the offensive line. The 3 kids you talked about that Notre Dame signed, that you've covered their recruitments. We know that they talk about that. They look at Notre Dame's track record with offensive tackles and say, hey, that matters. It helps them with tight end. And if they can start doing that in the secondary, boy, that would be absolutely huge. And the final piece too, Ryan, it'd be great for Cam because he really is. Anyone that's gotten to know Cam over the years or his family, he's an awesome kid. He really is. And you root for guys like that could have left. Cam could have left. He could have gone somewhere else. He could have gone pro last year, but he stuck around. He became a great representative of the university and the football program and turned out to be a pretty darn good flipping football player. I put something out today, Ryan. I know you saw what I put out, but the last 2 years, Marvin Harrison Jr., who is without a doubt an elite prospect.
Yep.
The last 2 years against Cam Hart and Benjamin Morrison, he combined for 5 catches on 12 targets for 51 yards.
Yep.
And against Cam Hart, he had 3 catches for 25 yards in the 2 years. So, you think about, here's the other thing that fits in with Cam too, that I don't think people are talking enough about. Look who Cam Hart's played against the last 2 years. CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, Drake May. There's 3 guys that are quarterbacks are going to be top 5 overall NFL draft picks, most likely, that he's played against. You look at Tanner McKee, you look at some of these other guys he's gone against, you look at the receivers he's gone against the last 2 years.
Yep.
This isn't old school Notre Dame where Notre Dame's playing a Big Ten dominant schedule, the Navy and Army and Air Force. And so your corners they have played some really good wide receivers and some really good quarterbacks the last 2 years as well. And Spencer Rattler, who everything I read now, he's a day 2 pick, like probably no brainer day 2 pick.
I had him in the third round of a mock, just based on what I'm hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
And they went against him as well. Now Cam didn't play in that game. Benjamin did, but you get the point. Notre Dame has gone against some very good corners, and Cam didn't play against USC last year. And Caleb Williams ripped him up. This year, Cam plays. What happens?
Sure.
It's part of the conversation. So very, very happy for him. Now, you just 6 picks later at the beginning of round 3, you have Blake Fisher going to with the number 68 overall pick to the New England Patriots. I got to tell you, Ryan, I am shocked by the rise of Blake Fisher this offseason. Happy about it, but shocked by it. And he's the one guy that I see all this buzz for that I'm like, I am very curious to hear if this is legit or not. Because here's the deal, Ryan. I'm going to kick it to you with this lead in. The talent tells you a story that this is a day 2 draft pick. The film tells you a completely different story. And I'm very curious to see which one wins the day, especially in what's considered a pretty good tackle class, Ryan. So what are you hearing about Blake Fisher, and where do you see – because, you have him early round 3. I know that you and I share the same concerns about Blake. So let's talk about Blake Fisher being a potential early day 3. And I've even seen some people have him late round 2.
Yeah.
in some of the mock drafts, Brian.
Well, I would say this about Blake. If I was just grading him based upon his film, he'd be a mid-day 3 player. Like that would just be where he is, because there's certainly talent, but there are some things that kind of just keep you wanting more, right? Like, I want more than that. I want more than that. And there's some context there, obviously. He's a very young player. He's still developing. I know he missed the majority of his freshman year, obviously, with the injury. So, like, there's some context there, right? But ultimately, Blake in 2023 was not what I expected Blake to be in 2023. I expected him to take a much bigger step. But that being said, the NFL loves size, which he obviously has. They love length, which he obviously has. And they love the tenacity that he has shown in spurts, right? Ohio State this past year is the game that he always mentions. That's the game that if you see me in that game, that's what I can do on a football field. And that's a great example. I think it is. I mean, Blake had a great game against Ohio State this past year. That was probably his best game I've ever seen him play.
Against NFL players, against guys that are going to be day 1, day 2 draft picks next year. Correct.
Yep. And so the buzz, so I'll share this because it's the information has been out in the universe now. But when he first declared, I reached out to Dane Brugler from The Athletic, who I think is excellent at this. And I asked him, like, hey, man, kind of a weird decision, in my opinion, on Blake. What do you think about it? And he's like, I'm very torn. He said the same thing that we're saying. He's like, I'm very torn on the player. Like the talent a lot, but I'm very torn on the player. But I'm hearing 3rd to 4th round grades right now on him. So at that point, they're talking about 3rd to 4th round around the NFL on Blake Fisher. And then he has a pretty good process. I think the biggest thing about him is check the arm length conversation with flying colors, really long arms, big frame. So
that's something you and I talked about, Ryan, that we weren't sure, because he's got this really kind of weird frame where his shoulders are kind of high and his arms don't look quite that long. So when I saw that he had longer arms than Joe Walt at the combine, I was genuinely shocked. Shocked.
And he has an 83+ inch wingspan, man. Yes. So he's a long dude. So
genuinely shocked.
I still think he would be a better guard than tackle, but the arm length conversation gives him a chance for a team to say, you know what, though, we're going to let him fail at offensive tackle first. Like, we're not going to make that move immediately. And I think that's where we are with Blake. And the other thing is, and this should be no surprise by anything you've ever heard of Blake Fisher, is that he interviewed really well. He's got a really good personality, and NFL teams seem to like it, right? He's obviously very studious, which a Notre Dame kid, shocker, but also he's got like a fun-loving personality, which is kind of some
tons and tons of community service work as well. Like he's a kid that, I've said this before, every time you see Notre Dame football team doing some, Toys for Tots or going to Ronald McDonald House or going to the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club, every time you saw that, he was there, it seemed like, and he was on the front lines of it. So those things help him, and some of the stuff that people that I've heard around the program, that some of the questions about Blake, about things that he needs to take things more seriously, that's and maybe Blake likes to have a little bit too much fun. I don't know that those are things NFL teams are going to be too concerned about, because they're not like criminal stuff,
malicious or
treats women disrespectfully, isn't coachable. It's none of that stuff. It's like he's a 21-year-old kid who, likes to enjoy college life a little too much. Like, you want that mature, you want him to kind of mature a little bit, but those aren't things that are going to be like giant red flag,
it's also the context of he was 20 years old until like a month or so ago, right? Like, he's a super young guy. Ultimately, I think that his personality is very attractive to NFL teams. I think his body type and his talent is very attractive to NFL teams. I mean, I think Daniel Jeremiah had him as his number 54 overall player in this class, second right? Rounder, so clearly NFL likes Blake Fisher. And I've just bought into that, right? If I was doing a mock draft based upon just what I would do personally, I probably would have waited till day 3 to draft Blake. I still would have taken a plunge pretty early on day 3 because I like the talent a lot. And if you can get the coaching well and get him to buy in, I think he could be a really excellent football player, right? But as a predictive mock, I think he's going to go on day 2. I would actually be shocked at this point if Blake Fisher's not a top 100 pick. Shocked. And I would actually be a little bit surprised if he's not a top half of round 3 at worst guy as well. Like, I think he's going to go high.
What are some teams, Ryan, that you kind of see as once you get into late round 2, early round 3? Obviously, the Patriots are obviously a team that you
Yes.
have because you have them mocked there.
They need
But what
offensive
are
linemen
some other
bad.
teams around there that you could see maybe? Because like Aaron Banks was this way. Aaron Banks is a very similar projection. Now, I think Aaron Banks' last year of film was a lot better than Blake Fisher's last year of film.
Agreed.
But Aaron had a lot of that inconsistency. You never know what you're going to get kind of from game to game. Young, raw, but great tools. And then we saw not only did Aaron get picked higher, I mean, it was like late round 2, round 3 grades for Aaron. He got picked early in round 2.
He did.
Like early in round 2, and he's turned out to be a pretty good football player. That's going to help Blake Fisher as well, that some of these guys end up going and getting, they go in the NFL and they produce, not just the Harry Heastand guys, but also a guy like Aaron Banks, who only played for Coach Heastand for 1 season as a redshirt player.
Right.
So who are some teams that if he was to go maybe a little bit higher or, in round 2, who are some teams to keep an eye on, either taking him late in the round or maybe somebody that jumps up? Because that's the other thing too, is some of these teams that are looking for tackles are going to miss out on that top group of guys.
Right.
And so they kind of, you see it all the time, Ryan, for everybody says, well, NFL teams, they don't act that. We see NFL teams all the time reach for certain positions, quarterback being one. What's the other? Offensive tackle. They get super desperate late in round 1 and in round 2 when that tackle board there's been a run on that tackle board, and Blake could benefit from it.
Especially a guy that could potentially project that offensive tackle, but also could play inside if you needed him to. And I think he could project very well in there. So that versatility, I think, could play into Blake's favor as well. Even though he never played guard in college, he has a body type and a physicality that I think could project well inside. Obviously, the New England Patriots, just based upon pure need, like they need offensive linemen, man. That's a bad offensive line right now. And there's several of those teams around the NFL, but they would be one. The Baltimore Ravens would be another because he fits that style, right? Like downhill, physical run game, get vertical. Like that is Blake Fisher's game. I can imagine him in the power scheme, just blocking down and blowing dudes out of gaps. Like that's what he fits. The other one, and I would actually hate to see this because I don't like the Philadelphia Eagles, but I think the Philadelphia Eagles would be a great spot for Blake Fisher for a couple reasons. One is Lane Johnson's starting to get very old in the tooth at right tackle. You're probably going to need a heir apparent at some point for him. 2, they have a need at right guard right now. Like they need a guy that could potentially come in and play guard. And I think that track of maybe Blake plays guard early and then he's the right tackle of the future. I think that would be a very interesting one. But then the main key thing is I think Blake needs great coaching. And Jeff Stoutland for the Philadelphia Eagles, the offensive line coach, in my opinion, is the best in the business on the NFL level. The Callahans are also very good on the NFL level, but for me, Jeff Stoutland is the best at developing traits. I mean, he took Jordan Mailata, who was a rugby player, and turned him into one of the highest paid offensive tackles in the NFL in only a few years, right? So working with Jeff Stoutland with the Philadelphia Eagles, I think that would be a really good spot with Blake because their tools are surely there. They just need a guy like Jeff Stoutland who's hard on players, but also very approachable for players too. Like he's a good balance of not always in your face unnecessarily, but in your face when he needs to be. But at the end of the day, his players love him. So Philadelphia Eagles, I think, would be a very interesting one.
Let's go next, Ryan. You have that is it for round 2, or you actually for round 2 it's Cam, but you have 2 guys going in round 3 for Notre Dame. Obviously, Blake Fisher being one, but you also have Audric Estimé going in round 3. You have him going to number 97 overall to the Cincinnati Bengals.
Yep.
Audric is a very intriguing player, Ryan. There's some people that really like him. This is I'm referring to draft Twitter, not NFL teams.
Sure.
Some people really like him.
You're a big fan of draft Twitter, so
well, it's all. I mean, that's it's so fun to read, man, because there's just so many experts,
different opinions.
It's just kind of fun. But whenever I read somebody that talks about what they're hearing from NFL teams, it sounds like Audric is a favorite. It sounds like from a lot of teams because of his unique size, athleticism kind of combination. Not necessarily the fastest guy, but really athletic. And I think that's what people are maybe missing the boat on a little bit when it comes to the draft Twitter sphere and why NFL teams are going to like him. So what are you seeing? What are you hearing about Audric, Ryan, and could you see him kind of being that next Notre Dame back to go to the NFL and has a lot of success like Kyron Williams?
Well, I think he brings a similar thing to Blake that I talked about. One, he's super young. He's one of only like 6 or 7 kids in this class that are going to be 20 years old when he's drafted.
Yep.
So he's very, very young. And also, one of the most energetic personalities you'll ever see. Like, just a great kid. I mean, he really is. And the great thing about him is, and this is good from the Notre Dame perspective, was barely played as a freshman, split carries as a sophomore. He doesn't have a lot of tread on his tires, which is good because some people would look at him and be like, big power back. Those guys can wear down with a lot of touches, right? But he doesn't have a lot of touches in him. Someone was asking me about someone was saying that like they like Braylon Allen, and we started having a conversation about the age and stuff. And funny enough, they're actually pretty similar ages. But then you talk about Braylon Allen, like Braylon Allen almost has twice as many touches in college as what Audric Estimé has coming out of Notre Dame. So that all is very attractive to players, attractive to teams, excuse me. I think he's probably going to go on late day two. I think third round is probably the sweet spot for Audric. I think if you would have tested a little better as far as the 40, maybe he goes in round 2. Like, I think that potentially is there, but I think it's third round, give or take a round. So he could last the fourth, maybe, but I think more than likely the third round in his spot, because teams love the physicality he brings, obviously, the decisiveness as a runner, the ability to create singles into doubles, which he did a lot at Notre Dame, of trying to creating hidden yardage. And he's super young with low tread on his tires. So all those things together, I think that he probably is going to go somewhere late on day 2. And I think that a team is going to have their opportunity. And in this situation, I gave him to Cincinnati, where Joe Mixon left this offseason. They have a good running back in Chase Brown, who's a little bit of a change of pace type back out of Illinois from last year. That would be, I think, a really good compliment, because they don't really have an early down bruiser like an Audric Estimé is.
Let's put some numbers to what you just said, Ryan. Yeah. Braylon Allen in 3 years at Wisconsin had 597 carries, 646 career touches, and he had 35 career touchdowns.
Yep.
This is something that I think matters too. Audric Estimé in his career at Notre Dame, both 3 years, 373 touches, carries, 399 total touches. So total touches for Braylon Allen, 646. For Audric Estimé, 399. Audric Estimé had 30 touchdowns. Braylon Allen had 35. This is something that people aren't talking about. Audric Estimé was a scoring machine for a guy that didn't touch the ball a lot. I mean, like Ryan, last year he had 156 carries. He scored 11 rushing touchdowns. This year he had 210 total carries, and he had 18 rushing touchdowns. He's scoring almost every 10 times he carries the football.
And despite being a bruiser, right, like a downhill type of runner, he averaged 6.4 yards a carry this year, man. That's a healthy average, my guys.
He averaged 6.2 for his career. His down year was 2022, when he played on a team with no pass attack, and he averaged 5.9 yards per carry.
Against loaded boxes every day.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. He's also a guy, Ryan, to me, that, and this matters too, is I've always felt like Audric was at his best when they played good teams. And like even Ohio State this year, the issue with him against Ohio State was that they stopped giving him the ball.
Right.
I mean, he had 70 yards on 14 carries, and he was just getting rolling in the second half. You look at him, the big play he had against Duke late in the game. You talk about how well he played, against Clemson, each of the last 2 years. I mean, his film against Clemson in 2022 was excellent. He went for 104 yards on 18 carries. His film against Clemson in 2023 was even better, even though he didn't have the same number of yards, 17 carries for 87 yards. But his film in that game was excellent, because the O-line didn't play nearly as well this year as it did last year.
He carried the team on his back against Clemson early.
Had 82 yards in the first half, and they just stopped giving him the ball in the second half for reasons that I still don't understand.
They went into panic mode in the second half, man. They went into panic mode, and it did not work out when you are a running football team, which that's another conversation for another day, I think. But well, actually, it's not even for another day. We've had that conversation, right? Where it's just like, why are we doing that? Like, why is that a thing?
A couple things I like too, Ryan. Two areas that were not good for not strengths for Audric his first couple years. Number one, he put the ball on the ground too much.
Yep.
And he was not great in pass pro for a guy as big as he is. Junior year, improved a lot in pass pro. Still room for improvement, but improved a lot in pass pro. And then he had that fumble in the first game against Navy. They sat him for a quarter, and I don't remember him putting the ball on the ground again the entire season. So I think he kind of checked that box a little bit too. Like, look, you coach him up, he's coachable, he's gonna do it. And I think one of the things that if I'm an NFL team, I'm paying attention to is, when Jabron Payne fumbles against Stanford, what does Marcus Freeman do? He goes right over to Audric Estimé and starts going off on Audric. Now, some people, we were like, what the heck is going on here? Like, did Audric say something? Like, what's the deal? And it was, no, Audric's is the leader of that room. I am holding it accountable. It says a lot about the relationship he had with the coaching staff, that he wasn't just a give me the ball, let me go do my thing guy. He was you're the leader of that. And you don't get that with a lot of running backs. I'm just going to be honest about that. You don't. Most running backs are just kind of go out there, get him the rock and do what he's going to do. Audric, there's a little bit more something to him. And I think that's going to help him.
And he's a great singer. Great singer too. No, so
not even remotely true. Not even remotely true.
He thinks he is though, so it's fine. He thinks he is.
Not even close to being true. Ryan, one of the biggest surprises that I saw from your mock draft is you have the next guy we're going to talk about. You have Marist Liufau going in round 5 of the NFL draft, Ryan. So let's talk about Marist. What are you hearing? What are your thoughts on Marist and where he could go in this year's draft?
Well, first and foremost, the context here is this linebacker class stinks. Like, it is a bad linebacker class, right? And it's funny. I think Dane Brugler had him as a 6th rounder or something like that pretty recently in a mock. I think the NFL might push him up a little bit just because of, one, he's got a very unique skill set, and we're in a world of the NFL right now, which is sub package and nothing else right now. I mean, base defense is just not really a thing anymore. It is a thing, but it's not nearly to the level that it once was. This is a sub league, and I believe that Marist Liufau, although he is very inconsistent as a linebacker, like very inconsistent from just a processing perspective, he does have a lot of upside as a sub player as far as a situational rusher and to blitz interior at times, working in the passing game and some one-on-one matchups against bigger slots or even some tight ends. Like, he has that type of upside. So I think a team because you have to ask yourself, like, what are teams looking for in a linebacker on day 3? 1, niche roles, great. Number 2, special teams upside. And I think Marist brings both of those things to the table. And hopefully he lands with a good team that can be patient with him and develop the instincts a little bit more, the processing, and maybe eventually he's a starter. But regardless, I think he's a depth piece to a room. I believe that he is a guy that's going to play a lot of special teams, and he could be a sub-package upside guy relatively early in his career because obviously he's a very good athlete with a lot of length on the second level.
I know his film in 2023 was better, but I just still look at it and I'm like, I'm very curious to see how Notre Dame's linebacking core plays this year. I'm just going to hold my thoughts until that, Ryan, and we'll see. I really hope Marist as well, because the one thing that we say, and it's going to sound very like, man, you guys are ND homers, but I think you all know me well enough to know that if I hear something, I'm either not going to say something or let you guys know this is what I'm hearing, especially once guys are done at Notre Dame. But everything I've heard about all these kids is great kid, leader, coachable, involved in the community. I mean, and we haven't even got to the guy that probably exemplifies that more than anyone, and we'll get to him in a little bit in JD Bertrand. But you hear this from all of them, and look, that stuff matters. That could be the thing that you got 2 guys on film. They're similar athletes. They got similar production. They're both from Power 5 schools. What could be the thing that separates us between taking him or taking him? It's This guy was constantly getting in trouble, didn't get high marks from his coaches about coachability, because college coaches tend to be, especially position coaches, tend to be pretty honest. A lot of them tend to be pretty honest with NFL teams, because if I lie to you about this kid, then I'm going to screw over every other kid that comes along, down the pike, in the future, because they're not going to listen to me. But everything you hear about these kids, it's good kid, hard worker, coachable, good in the community, went to class, did his thing. And, it's although it is kind of funny, he's in a relationship with a young lady where he might not be the best player in his sport in his relationship because he's dating Sonia Citron on the basketball team. But in all seriousness, I'd love to see Marist go higher. I just have seen so much film over the years where I'm just like, he finished well, but he just never quite was that guy that I kind of hoped he would be. You were just always kind of waiting on that light to go on, and it just never did.
Special teams has its spot, though.
Yes, it does.
Special teamer on day
Yes, it
3.
does. And pass rusher. I mean, there's some things he can do there as well.
Absolutely.
So you have Marist Liufau go number 6. Now we get into fifth round. Now let's get into round 6, Ryan. And this next guy we'll talk about is J.D. Bertrand.
Yep.
J.D. was consistently round 6 and 7 in mock drafts for a while.
Mm-hmm.
After the combine pro day period where he wasn't able to really participate in both, I've seen a lot more people leave him off of their draft board. So I want you to kind of do 2 parts to this, Ryan. Number 1, I want you to just talk about what you're hearing and what you're seeing about JD, why you have him around 6.
Mm-hmm.
And then number 2, could you see a scenario where maybe he does drop later or even out of the draft because of the fact he just wasn't able to go out there? You and I think he can run. Yep. And I know Notre Dame's going to have their GPS data, which helps kids a lot more nowadays than it used to, because they actually do have legitimate data. Hey, I know the kid couldn't run, but here's the GPS numbers, but still couldn't perform. So 2 parts. 1, what you're hearing, why you see him being a 6th round pick. And you had him, I didn't say this, I apologize. You had him go number 202 overall to the Green Bay Packers. Yes. And then part 2 is, how do you think his injury could impact where he ultimately lands this weekend?
Well, I mean, it hurts him, right? And I honestly, I actually wanted to get him just a touch higher, maybe like 15-ish picks higher, because this linebacker class stinks that I already talked about, right? Like, it's not good. And there are some people that I really respect that have a little bit of a higher opinion on JD Bertrand. Like I mentioned Dane Bruckler, who had a 5th round grade, I believe, on him in his draft guide. So there's some people that I really think are plugged in and have good opinions that are higher on JD than even myself is, because I have my doubts about JD on the next level. I do. And obviously being the number 202 overall pick. Length and coverage.
Length and coverage. Yep.
And him being the number 202 pick, that does not mean that he's going to be on a roster or make a roster in 2024. Like, there's no guarantee that happens. But I think that when you talk about a kid who has a baseline of being incredibly intelligent, in the right spot, and productive, those things matter, like especially later in the draft. Those things matter because there was a couple linebackers that are on the board that they might be slightly more athletic than JD, but they're just such wild cards, man. Like, such wild cards. I think that some teams do like a little bit more of a known commodity at points in the draft. And that's what JD is. He is a known commodity. I think it stinks for him that he wasn't able to run, because I think he would have ran good enough that you would have been like, okay, we could have checked that box a little bit.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he wasn't able to run. And I think that some teams will have a little bit of, and yes, they have the GPS data and they saw him at the Senior Bowl and he looked fast, on the field that week, in my opinion. But overall, they just don't have that number to back it up. And some scouts are very archaic in their view of how they verify things, right? So I think it hurts him a little bit, but I still lean toward him being drafted. I do, because I just think that his stay power, his consistency, his production, like all those things just kind of speak to him at least being drafted and getting a shot. From there, it's going to be about, can JD crack a rotation or find a 53? I'm not sure I would necessarily predict that, but I do think that he gets an opportunity potentially, because the day 3 falls off the table for one. Linebacker class is not good, and I think JD has some of the more consistent film, although not the highest upside in the class.
Ryan, when we talk about character, this is the guy I was referring to with JD Bertrand. I mean, you're talking about a 2-time captain in Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. You're talking about a kid that everybody just raves about as a young man. And I thought Jim Nagy shared something about JD this week, if you want to just kind of relay that story. But it just speaks volumes about the kind of young man he is, especially in this era where, I think Tom Brady's right. I think a lot of older athletes are right. I don't think it's just, spite of you're hating on the younger generation that a lot of people – no, I think it's genuine. And there is a lot more sense of entitlement now with young people than there was in the past. Or even – players maybe that aren't entitled have a lack of appreciation for the things that are coming to them. And you've got a kid like JD Bertrand with what he did with Jim Nagy, I just think speaks volumes about, just forget the football part, just the kind of kid that he is.
Well, I actually didn't even see the story that
you didn't
about. No.
Okay. So basically, Jim said at the end of the Senior Bowl, JD came up to him and gave him a handwritten note, basically just thanking him for everything he's done and the opportunity. And he's like, this never happens.
Least shocking thing in the world.
Yeah,
right?
But not just coming up and shaking his hand and thanking him, which is good. Not sending him an email, which is good. Something that could maybe have been written by his agent. He literally walked up and gave him a handwritten note, a card, basically thanking him for everything. And you're just like, and it just see, kids can do that. I'm like, you act like an a-hole all week, and then you hand me this card because your agent told you to be the right thing to do.
Right.
But it tracks right with everything that you hear about JD Bertrand.
Right.
And it's why he's such an easy kid to root for, because somebody in the chat said it. JD Bertrand is going to be successful in life, whether he plays a snap in the NFL or not.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I could see him being a coach too. I mean, potentially even like, I mean, he has that type of side.
I don't know if JD's going to take that kind of pay cut to become a coach.
Eventually. We'll see a couple years from now. I don't know.
He's walking away with a master's degree from Notre Dame. He's going to make a lot more money than what a high school football coach is.
JD's basically the reverse Stetson Bennett, which is absolutely hilarious. But yeah. Man, he's a great kid, and character matters, obviously, because I think we forget about the fact that this next 3-day period is about players being drafted to teams, but it's also about people being drafted to an organization. And we completely forget about that sometimes, that character does matter. Why do Notre Dame players who aren't even drafted high tend to stick in the NFL? It's because they have great character, man. Why did Matthias Farley outplay him not even being drafted? Why is Nick McLeod sticking around? Why are those kids finding sticking points? It's because they work their butts off and they just are grateful for every part of it, right? So
Troy Pride's getting signed by the Texans after basically missing 2 years with injuries.
Yep.
Because again, hey, maybe he's a good player, maybe he's not, but this is the kind of attitude you bring in and you give a shot to, essentially. Because I always feel like round 6 and 7 is where you find kids like that, or kids that are incredibly talented, but the complete opposite. And you're taking a chance on them one way or the other.
Unfortunately, I've been talking to a bunch of agents the last couple of days and a couple of scouts, and there's some kids that I've heard are dropping in this class because they are not great people. You know what I mean? Like, it happens every single year.
And we see with the kid from Texas, the guy, who already had alcohol issues in his past, and then he goes out. Like, you're just like, dude, you're a month away from fulfilling your dream. You can't put the
and that holds, and not to throw shade at T'Vondre Sweat, but like also he apparently in this draft process was open like unnecessarily to teams and be like, hey, I just want to be out in front on this. That like I did a little too much partying, drank too much alcohol, like it was an issue, and it's been reversed. And then he comes back and he does the same thing.
Because if you're going to say that to them and then you do this here, they're going to think this kid's got a problem.
And he lied to us probably a little bit. Yeah.
What's that?
And he lied to us probably a little bit because obviously you don't have it completely under control.
His agent's telling him he needs to, we're going to find out about it anyway.
Yeah.
So let's, get ahead of it. But then, you guy like Rashee Rice potentially throwing his career away. Henry Ruggs throwing his career away. Yeah. That stuff's just not worth it, man. And look, we've had Notre Dame kids have bad draft processes. I remember a story about a player that was drafted very high for Notre Dame in the last 5 years. You know what I'm talking about. And someone that knew him well went up to him in the middle of the combine and said, dude, you're blowing it.
Right.
I'm talking to NFL teams and scouts, and they're telling me you are coming across like a total prick. And he kind of shaped up and had a better draft process. But everybody has those guys, and it was not Chase Claypool, by the way. It wouldn't have shocked me if it was Chase Claypool, but no, it was not Chase Claypool. I don't think Chase is a prick. I think Chase is just whatever. Just doesn't love football. Just kind of a.
I was also going to say, like, I don't know if I would say entitled, but like he thinks he's the man is an athlete. He doesn't have to work that hard at it. You know what I mean? Like just one of those guys. So
yeah.
So
round 7, Ryan, you have 2 former Notre Dame players in round 7, both transfers. So this is where the transfers fall. So number 1, you have Javontae Jean-Baptiste going number 223 overall to the Las Vegas Raiders. He was a guy that when he came to Notre Dame, we felt probably an undrafted free agent, depending on how things go with Notre Dame. I've seen anything from rounds 5 to 7. I actually saw a mock draft today that had him in round 5 from someone, I think it was Jordan Reed.
I think it was too.
So someone that we respect had him in round 5. So this is one of those, I've probably seen the biggest range of picks for him in the last couple of weeks than anybody that Notre Dame has. What do you see round 7? Or what do you see? What are you hearing that have you put him in round 7? And do you think there's a chance, based on what you're hearing, that maybe he does go a little bit higher than where you have projected right now?
Well, I think that people always have a chance to rise when they do everything the right way, right? Like we just talked about. And Javontae is that dude. Like Javontae Jean-Baptiste, he is not the most exciting athlete as a defensive end. He is not going to corner consistently around the outside track. He's just not the best athlete in space overall. But what does he do? He does the little things, man. Like, he plays with pretty good technique. He plays physically. He's strong, and he sets a firm edge, and he'll reduce down when you need him to reduce down. Like, he does everything the right way. So I'm not shocked that Jordan had him in the 5th round. I think that he could slot and move up to a mid day 3 player, right? Like, I think that he has that type of upside to him. But I kind of left him a little bit later in the draft just because I like everything about him from a sticking point perspective. Like, I think that he could potentially stick on a roster for a couple years. But I just, the lack of traits and full transparency, I have some of my misses early as an evaluator were me not valuing athletic traits and the edge enough. And I just don't see necessarily a massive upside to him, right? Like, I don't see a guy that's ever going to be a guy that's going to be a starter unquestioned and be a high volume sack guy. Like, I just don't see that dude, but I see a guy that I think can make a roster potentially, which is why I have him late day 3. I have him getting drafted, but I just also think that he's a guy that might have some limitations to why he is a little bit down in my mock draft.
Ryan, I think we saw that a little bit at the Senior Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you saw him struggling to win on the edge in one-on-ones and in the game and in practices especially, where he just wasn't able to kind of take what he did at Notre Dame and then translate it. And so I tend to agree with where you have him, just because when I think of in the past guys like him, that's where they tend to fall. But production, he had very good production and very good film. And here's the thing also about Javontae Jean-Baptiste that I think helped him more than anything is he was money this year in Notre Dame's big games.
Yeah.
He was really good against Ohio State. He was really good against USC. He was one of the few defensive linemen that I thought played well against Louisville, to be honest with you. He was pretty good against Duke. So he really stepped up in some big moments where Notre Dame needed him to make big plays. And he was also clutch in a moment standpoint. So I think that's going to help him a little bit too. That is why I do feel like he'll get drafted, because I think that stuff matters as well. Like, okay, fine, you racked up sacks, but you had 2.5 sacks against Central Michigan, and you had a sack and a half against Tennessee State, and you had 2 sacks against Wake Forest. Like, okay, yeah, but you got dominated by Ohio State, USC, and Clemson. Right. That's not true for Javontae Jean-Baptiste. He actually played his best moments in those games, which I think matters as well. Because I know a lot of NFL teams love that about Khalid Kareem when he was coming out too. I've heard that from many people. And if it wasn't for his shoulder injury, number one, Khalid would have got drafted a lot higher. And number two, he would have stayed in the NFL a lot longer. His shoulder was never the same after the shoulder injury. But and Javontae has a little. He's kind of my poor man's Khalid, actually. There's a lot of similarities in how they play. Khalid was just bigger, longer, stronger, and a little bit more dynamic athletically, in my opinion, Javontae. Then rounding things out, Ryan, Sam Hartman.
Yes.
You have Sam Hartman going number 239 overall, I believe, 237 overall to the 237 overall to the Cincinnati Bengals. So in your mock draft, the Bengals find their backup for Joe Burrow. And I'm going to be honest with you, Ryan, I love this fit.
Yeah.
Because you have a guy that is a veteran player, lots of experience, good teammate, and if something happens again to your star, you have a guy that can maybe get you out of a couple games, in his career. I could see Sam Hartman carving out a very long NFL career as a Chase Daniels type backup quarterback. To be honest,
he is. Look, I mean, first and foremost, to the fit, there's not enough good quarterbacks in the NFL, backup quarterbacks. There's just not. I mean, every week where I feel like we're seeing a Mike White or some random Tim Boyle guy
Jaron Hall
starting
games in the NFL, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. So
the Broncos starting quarterback as of right now, their top 2 quarterbacks are Jarrett Stidham and Ben DiNucci.
Don't forget about Zach Wilson. Don't forget about Zach Wilson, man.
I'm talking about that's how desperate you were for a quarterback that you made the trade for Zach Wilson to support your point.
You make a great point, because the fact that Ben DiNucci is in the NFL is another opinion out there as far as verification that, like, quarterback play is not great, man. Like, it's just not from a backup quarterback perspective. I mean, there's just some random dudes out there. So I still believe that Sam Hartman could stick on the NFL level. I do, right? I think that he's not going to get drafted super high. I think he's going to be a 6th to 7th rounder, probably, is like my sweet spot, because He has a below average arm for NFL standards. He's a very average athlete for NFL standards, probably slightly below average, and he's a little bit of a smaller guy as well. Is he a very charismatic kid? Absolutely. Is he smart? Absolutely. Does he have tons of production and experience? Absolutely. So those things are the reasons that I think that he can stick on the NFL level. For the Cincinnati fit, look, it's not ideal that Sam Hartman's your starter for multiple games, right, on the NFL level, but Joe Burrow is a little bit injury prone at this point. I mean, it's a couple injuries now into his career, and you have to have something behind him, right? Like
And you
I don't
can't
know.
afford to go pay for a veteran backup, Ryan, because those guys aren't exactly cheap when you're a team that's trying to pay all your stars all this money.
Mhm.
Which is they're getting up on that. Joe's got a big contract now, I believe, right? And you've got they're going to have to want to pay Jamar, Chase here pretty soon, and they've got Trey Hendrickson's asking for a trade out of Cincinnati because he's not making enough money. They might have to trade T. Higgins because they don't either have the money or don't want to pay the money to keep him. So you get yourself a veteran quarterback that you can have signed for 4 years that's going to make literally the league minimum. Be a good teammate. Sure, why not? Right? Why not take a chance on a guy like that in round 7? Agree with you completely.
And at that point, I wanted to give the Bengals a quarterback because that was one of their needs on the board still, trying to find a backup throughout the draft. And at that point, I didn't realize this at first, Brian. I actually think like the first top 5 to 6 quarterbacks in this class, although a couple are overrated, it's pretty talented group overall, just like raw skills, right? Mm-hmm. But then after that, class falls off pretty quick, man. At that point, it was either Sam Hartman or Carter Bradley from South Alabama. So I was like, I'll go with Sam Hartman here as a backup potentially, and maybe he'll stick on the next level.
So that's going to wrap it up for the Notre Dame portion, Ryan. We're going to next talk about just the first round overall and just kind of what some of your thoughts are in round 1. So obviously what we're hearing, and I think now is when you start to see some things kind of get finalized at the top of the draft. Obviously, the Bears are taking Caleb Williams. We're hearing, from legitimate NFL sources that the Commanders have locked in on Jaden Daniels. And the thing that I heard about an hour before we started the show was that the Patriots are locking in on Drake May. Now, that could be a smoke screen. Obviously, your mock draft came out before all that started to come out, where there was a lot of talk. I mean, just as of last night, I was having some fun doing a round 1 mock draft, Ryan, just for fun on the PFF simulator. And I actually had Drake May going 5 because everything I was reading as of yesterday was that the Patriots like J.J. McCarthy, or they may even take someone that's not a quarterback. They weren't locked into a quarterback.
Here's my take on number 3. If the Patriots stay there, they'll take Drake May, but I think that they also are a high. I don't want to say high likelihood, but I believe that they can trade out. And if they do trade out, I actually think a team's coming up for JJ and not for Drake. As funny as that sounds,
I agree with you, and I think that's going to be a mistake. But yes, I agree with you. I don't think either one of those guys are necessarily top 5 quarterbacks. I think you have Drake as your number 3 quarterback in this draft class, right?
Yep.
He's number 2 for me. I really like Drake May. He's another young and true junior. I think he's got loads of potential. But yeah, we've talked about this. His junior film was not great. I think a lot of it had to do with the coaching he received in the town around him. But we'll see. But yeah, I would not be shocked if the J.J. McCarthy stuff is one of 2 things. They're falling in love with the winner thing, or he's this year's Will Levis. You know what I mean? Where they're using him as that. Let's see if we get hype around this guy so the guy that I want falls. You know what I mean? Let's build up all this hype around, if you're the Giants or if you're, a team looking to trade up but you don't have the ammo to go all the way up to 3. Let's see if we can do enough to get JJ to be that guy. So maybe Drake can fall to 5 or 6 and then we might be able to move up. I mean, that stuff happens in the NFL, Ryan. You and I 100%. Both know that. Yep. And so that's where the smoke about Will Levis going number 4 last year, the day before the draft, comes from a very reputable, trusted NFL person in Daniel Jeremiah, and he doesn't even go round 1. That's I can't believe this guy's falling. Well, that's because he was never ever going to be that high of a pick.
That's another thing that's planted in people's minds, though. He puts out that thing, and there's no association between Indianapolis and Anthony Richardson. You know why? Because they were always going to take Anthony Richardson. That was just their guy.
They didn't want anybody
right or wrong. That was their guy.
Exactly. Who was much better as a rookie than I thought, Ryan. I've gone back and kind of
man. I hope he's able to stay healthy because it's been a little bit of a thing the last couple of years with him. But yeah, man, he was playing well.
I thought he was going to need a year to develop. I did.
Well, I'll throw a big shout out to Shane Steichen, who's the head coach for the Indianapolis Colts. He did tremendous things with Jalen Hurts the year before as his offensive coordinator. So I think that guy's just a really good offensive coordinator and quarterback developer or quarterback helper, I guess is more a better way to put it.
So Ryan, we have the run on quarterbacks that's going to happen. I believe you have 4 going in your top 5, correct? Because you have Caleb Williams going number 1 to the Bears. You have Jaden Daniels going number 2 to LSU. You have J.J. McCarthy going number 3 to the Vikings, who would then basically trade 11 and 23, correct?
Yes.
With the Patriots to move up to number 3. You have Arizona taking Marvin Harrison 4, and then the New York Giants trading up a spot to get Drake May. So once we get past the quarterback run, let's talk about the first round. What do you see as the strengths of this draft class?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a very offensive heavy class overall. I mean, I think I have one defensive player in the top 10, and it was number 8 to the Atlanta Falcons, right? And I think that is very realistic. Again, this was a predictive mock. I would be shocked if we have more than one defensive player in the top 10. Shocked. I mean, for context purpose, I'm telling you that 90% of the top 10 is going to be offensive players. 90%.
Actually, 11 of the 10 of the top per your mock, 10 of the top 11. Yeah, because you don't have a second player being drafted till Kerryon Mitchell with number 12 with the Broncos. Quinyon Mitchell, excuse me.
It is a big-time offensive class this year. And it's not a bad defensive class necessarily. It's just we don't really have the elite guys at the top. Like you have a couple of very talented quarterbacks this year that we always know that NFL teams are going to push for. It's a really good offensive tackle class. It's a really good wide receiver class. Like those are the 3 most important ones. I think corner is another really good one, but overall it is an offensive heavy class. So I think that after the quarterbacks go, my biggest question mark is, does the wide receiver run start immediately or does the offensive tackle run start immediately? Because that's going to determine a lot of what happens the next like 10 or 15 picks. I think that it's going to be more offensive tackle driven right after that, because I actually had a wide receiver falling a little bit compared to where he's been mocked mostly. And I had Malik Neighbors go number 9 to the Chicago Bears in this mock draft.
So if the Bears come away from this draft with Caleb Williams and Malik Neighbors, it's either going to end up being beautiful or horrible, because you have 2 kids that are freaky talents, but also some questionable aspects to them. Volatile is a good way of putting it. Very good way of putting it. Yeah. So that can end up being a grand slam home run for the Bears that completely changes the face of their franchise, like what Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase have done with the Bengals. Or it becomes like, yep, it's the Bears being the Bears, man. It really is. So yeah, I did notice that. And then you have a Dunze going 10.
Yep.
And so it is going to be fascinating, because that like you said, it affects the next 10 or 15 picks. If all of a sudden those receivers fall down, then what do teams do? Hey, look, we can trade up and get one of the top receivers, or hey, receivers are falling down, we can hold pat, and maybe a Brian Thomas or somebody like that falls to us. I also think there's some receivers in round 2, Ryan, and I'm going to set you up for this one because I know you and I are on the same page on this. I know that there's some guys that are going to be available in round 2 that are going to shock some people that I think could be like Michael Pittman's and T. Higgins, who end up being really good football players. And the guy that I still am floored by I'm curious to see if NFL teams actually feel this way, that draft Twitter and even reputable analysts feel, which is that Keon Coleman's a 2nd-round pick. Right. I watched that kid play, and I'm like, I know what the testing said, but I also know what my eyes tell me when I watch this kid's film at Michigan State and at Florida State. And that is, he played with a gamer, but a very inaccurate quarterback in a very college system that I see being a 6'4", really athletic, knows how to play, knows how to win kind of guy. And if you don't believe me, go watch the LSU film this year. I mean, he was tremendous in that game.
I mean, I love Keon Coleman. I think I had him as a top 12 player in this class for me personally. I'm bought into the athleticism, to the physicality, and also one of the only few players in this class that are going to be 20 years old after this weekend, right? So he's going to get drafted. He's super young. Does he need to play with a little bit more nuance and patience as a wide receiver? Absolutely. Does he need to just be a little bit more willing to be passive? Is not the right word, but he's one of those guys that You remember Jamar Chase coming out of LSU. He was fantastic. But one thing that people didn't like about Jamar Chase, and I clearly understood, was he just tried to bully everyone all the time. And he didn't have any attention to detail as a player because he was just trying to out-physical everyone. And it was just like, Jamar, like, you're a good athlete, bro. Like, you don't have to just physically push off dudes all the time and just be that guy that just kind of initiates contact. You could be a little more patient as a player. And I feel the same about Keon. Like, I think Keon just needs to kind of chill out a little bit, get some good coaching, and he has superstar upside. I really do. But ultimately, it's going to be tough because he is a kid that's a little bit of a developmental guy as far as early on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a class that has a lot of great pass catchers, man. So I have him going in the early second round. I would personally take him in the first round, and I would have no hesitation on it. But I just think that when you're talking about the loaded wide receiver class we have, he's a guy that I think could fall down a little bit just because he might not be the ready-made prospect that obviously a Roma Dunze is, or even a Lad McConkey is early in the second round. Like, just a little bit more of a volatile player, but the upside is tremendous.
You know what's going to piss me off, Ryan?
Yeah.
This is exactly what's going to happen.
Okay.
We're going to fall to the end of the first round.
Yep.
And the Kansas City Chiefs are going to be freaking sitting there at number 32. And a guy like Keon Coleman is going to fall to them. And you're going to be like, seriously? Seriously?
That's what they need, man.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, he would be the there's two teams that I have. And I want to get, again, I'm doing this as a fan, right? So everybody and Ryan does this, for a living. I'm doing this as a fan. But there's two teams that I'm looking at late in round one that I could see stealing Keon Coleman, and it would be a major needle mover for me. The Chiefs are one. The other one is a few spots ahead of them. I could see the Detroit Lions at number 29 saying, because all their receivers are cookie cutters, in my opinion, of each other. Shorter. And I'm watching and I'm like, if they just had a big guy that could just win over the top and win over the middle, this offense would be really dangerous. And so I had him actually going 29 in my mock draft of the Lions, but I could see the Chiefs sitting there at 32 and Keon falls to them. And then just once again, the Chiefs sit home at 32 and get some dude that keeps their thing rolling, which even though I've quit the Broncos, I can promise you this, Ryan, I will never be a fan of a AFC West team.
Chief Kingdom?
Yes.
No?
I love watching Pat Mahomes play. I don't have a disdain for the Chiefs at all. I respect the heck out of that franchise.
Yep.
But it's just like the NFL keeps doing these dumb things, and that's why teams like them keep winning. Steelers were like this for a long time, where they would just kind of sit home in the late 20s and just let all these teams take these high upside guys that weren't actually good football players, and then the Chiefs would stay home and get some really good football player at like 22 or 25, and you're just like, seriously, every year this happens. And the Chiefs have become that franchise. Where it's like, you're seriously going to let that guy fall to you? You're going to seriously let that guy fall to you? And I think some team like that's going to get a really good wide receiver late in the first round because of how deep it is.
Yep. It's very possible. It's very possible because I think there's a little bit of overthink with Keon to a degree, right? I do think that there are some justifiable things that you look at and say, that worries me a little bit. The lack of separation, the lack of nuance.
Coachable things, though, Ryan.
Well, exactly.
Coachable things.
Exactly. I mean, he kind of got the Audric Estimé treatment a little bit. It was like the rest of his combine was awesome, but then he ran 4.61, and that's just all people wanted to talk about. And it's just
yet he runs like 2-3 miles an hour faster than most of the other receivers going through the gauntlet. Because that's the thing. When that kid's playing, he's that kind of guy, man.
Well, I would put it like this. How many 6'3", 6'4", 250-pound guys do you know that return punts for their team? Like, that's just a testament to the type of athlete that I think he is. If he can figure it out and he gets good coaching and he's a part of a good system, I think that Keon has a chance to be a very, very good football player on the next level. It is going to take a little bit more patience than maybe a couple of guys, but that patience could pay off big time.
Here's an interesting position, Ryan. You've talked about tackle being a strength of this class. And I think you said something earlier when we were talking about Notre Dame that I think is very fascinating. It's going to be the thing that could really make this an interesting day one. Is I do like the top of the tackle class quite a bit. Joe Walt, you've got, Olu Fashanu, you've got the kid from Oregon State, you've got the kid from Washington who I like. Not quite as much as where I'm seeing him being projected, but after that top five, and J.C. Latham is an enigma to me that we can talk about if you want, But after that top group that I see constantly projected, I think there's a bit of a drop off. And I think we could see situations where teams panic and trade up to 19 and take a Tyler Guyton or
Oof.
type of player.
It's possible. It's possible.
Right.
Yeah.
We see this every year at that position. That's my point. I'm not doing it, but we see this all the time where teams panic because of the early run at tackle. And then they trade up and they, like the Raiders taking trading up, I believe, a couple of years ago to take Alex Leatherwood. We remember what the Texans did. Right. We remember what the Texans did the year they took, who was it, Titus Howard?
Titus Howard, maybe Alabama State. Yep.
Who was it that reached for Andre Dillard at the end of the first round
Eagles.
1 year, right? Because it was like, hey, we're panicking. So that's quarterback and offensive tackle more than any other position, to me, are the two positions that can cause otherwise smart NFL people to make really dumb decisions. And I'm curious if that's going to happen. If the tackle run starts early like you think it could,
yes,
I'm very curious to see how that impacts 20 to 32 in regard to teams trading up and trying to get in there to take one of those next in line tackles.
I mean, it's very possible because I've made my peace with JC Latham. I think JC Latham could be a butt kicker at guard potentially, but I have serious issues with his balance issues, and he gets a lot of penalties, man. Like those things scare the heck out of me for a guy that big. Like it really scares the heck out of me. But I've made my peace with him. I think he has a place, and I'm willing to bet on him more than I am with Tyler Guyton, for instance, who's a very good athlete out of Oklahoma, but stiff as a board, man. Like he can't bend. I don't know what we're doing with that one. I really don't know. I would rather be patient with guys like Roger Rosengarten in the second round out of Washington, a Karam Abangaji out of Yale as a second to third rounder. Like there's still value to be found in this class. I do think though and this is offensive line evaluation failure at offensive tackle, because I think the NFL for the most part, they do pretty well with evaluating interior players because it's easier to find, right? Offensive tackle is such an interesting position because if I showed you the top 10 highlight plays of JC Latham from this past year, you'd be like, that kid's a top 10 pick. But then you watch the rest of it where you're just like, I'm not sure. That's just not who he is all the time. And that's why some people undervalue Joe Alt, because maybe his highlights aren't as quite as flashy as a JC Latham, but like his game to game is much, much better and much cleaner. So I think that people fall for the flash. That's why Tyler Guyton's getting pushed up, and Tyler Guyton's going to be a first round pick, even though I didn't have him in my mock draft, just because I refused to do it. But he's going to get drafted in the first round.
So you see where I'm coming from, though, Ryan. Yeah. Like that's going to happen. We see it all the time, and I agree with you because some of those second round players are not the sexy athletes, and this is exactly the point that I made about Alex Leatherwood. Yes. You could give me his top 10 plays, and he's going to be one of the more impressive guys on this clip. Like when you show his 10 clip highlight, you're going to be like, wow, that guy must be really good. But I didn't think he was like, to me, I'm going to use a guy that you love as an example. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a difference between Alex Leatherwood and Amarius Mims.
Yeah. Like
where Amarius Mims is still a highlight reel guy because of the fact he just has such limited opportunities because of health. But when he's been healthy, he's a much more consistent player than an Alex Leatherwood was.
Yes.
Over a period of time. So like I'm Alex Leatherwood. I think of the kid that went Isaiah Wilson that have these great highlight reels, but I'm like, did you actually watch that kid play on a consistent basis? And this is where this is why I would never let an O-line coach in the room on draft day. Because they will convince themselves that you give me that kid and I can coach him up more than any other position. Where quarterback coaches will be kind of like, nah, coach, I don't want that guy. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's not, where O-line, I'll fix him. I'll get him going. And I'm just like, can you get grandpa out of the room, please? Because we're not drafting that kid. But that's how you talk yourself into an Alex Leatherwood in the top 20. And Isaiah Wilson late in the first round. You know what I mean? Like, and of course, colossal busts.
Yes.
Right. And so, but that's what happens is you fall in love with the dominant reps. I said this last week about talking about Notre Dame. I don't care if Tosh Baker or Emil Wagner ever have a dominant block in their lives. If they just do their job every snap, that's all I care about at right tackle. That's it next year. It's all I care about. And I don't think enough people understand that when talking about offensive line because they fall in love with this mauling clip and they just like, this guy's just not that good though. He can't bend. He can't get it. He can't get into a kick slide and handle any kind of pressure. It's just that's why there's so many misses.
Yeah. Well, Alex Leatherwood was one that I predicted the Alex Leatherwood thing was going to happen. I predicted him
Seriously?
going early in the first round. Yeah. Yeah. I predicted it. Yeah. Because he was one of those guys that he played so much football at Alabama and he had the length and all that type of stuff. You're just like, yeah, the team's going to draft him high. Like it's going to happen. But I remember watching this film, just like, guys, this is like a fringe day 2 player.
It's
maybe.
funny. There's been a lot of Bama guys like that. Like the 2012 offensive line had a lot of busts on it. And I'm like, guys, none of these guys are stars. They're all just good players that play really well together and they're huge.
Yep.
But none of them are projecting. James Carpenter was a bust in Seattle, if I remember correctly. DJ Fluker was never what people thought he was. And
he was okay.
Ended up being a decent guard, which is, not a surprise. The Kajando kid was a guy that ended up he was second round. I think he fell to the second round because of injuries, if I remember correctly.
Cyrus Kwanjo,
right?
Yeah.
And then Barrett Jones,
fourth rounder.
Yeah. And I don't know that any of those guys really were, but that's the thing. You can fall in love with this line and Bama and they're big and but they're a great unit. They're not, none of those guys are necessarily individually great. I do think there's been a lot of Bama guys overdrafted at certain positions.
Oh, no doubt.
D-line, O-line especially. And the performances of those players. D-line has actually kind of improved in recent years. But there was a stretch there where Bama was putting out a bunch of D-linemen and like none of them were panning out.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And recently we've seen a lot more of that. So
Alabama's like the reverse Notre Dame in offensive line, right? Like where Notre Dame develops them well and some of them go underrated for whatever reason. Alabama, everyone's kind of overrated and don't do well in the NFL.
Sometimes the sum is greater than the individual parts, and Bama is a perfect example of that, in my opinion. So, Ryan, what are some things that you could see happening on draft day? So let's just, these aren't necessarily predictions as we wrap up. And I know you got to run here, but as we kind of wrap this up, what are some things that either A, you're hearing, number one, and then B, just some thoughts that you have of just, studying the draft over the years that you could say, hey, keep an eye on this, not predictions, but just some things that you think, hey, I'm hearing this may happen. There may be a corner run at this time. Just as an example, or there may be this. What are some things you're hearing? And then what are some things that you say, hey, keep an eye on this here late round 1, or this is what, because I could see some things happening tonight that make tomorrow before day 2 starts be crazy with teams trying to get up and those type of things.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a couple predictions, I guess, or a couple things that I'm very interested to see. One, as I said before, I think that the Atlanta Falcons are the only team that's going to take a defensive player in the top 10. I'm just not sure who that's going to be. Most people seem to think it's going to be Dallas Turner from Alabama, the edge rusher, which very well could be. I mean, it's a player that makes sense for them to move into a 3-4 system, but I'm not certain that it's not going to be a corner. So Quinyon Mitchell, I think, is an interesting player to watch at number 8 out of Toledo. I also say Terrion Arnold out of Alabama, the other corner, I think is an interesting player to watch at potentially 8. So who that first defensive player is off the board. A guy that I think is going to go a lot earlier than people think, and one that's going to slide, same position, Zach Frazier, the center from West Virginia. I think he's going to be a first-round pick. I think he could go top 25, potentially. It's possible, based upon what I'm hearing. The other guy that I think is going to fall, I had him in my first-round mock just because I really do like his film, but he's got a little bit of medical stuff, is Jackson Powers Johnson, the center out of Oregon. I think he could slide potentially out of the first round. He just has some durability stuff that he's kind of working. It's working against him right now. So those are a few, I guess, of the main ones that I have right now. I think that the corner run is going to start somewhere in the preteens to teens, somewhere in that ballpark. And I'm very curious to see where A.D. Mitchell is going to come off the board as well. That's my last guy because people make a lot of things about diabetes and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of things around A.D. Mitchell right now, but I've heard some people say he could be a top 25 pick. I've heard other people say that he's going to slide into the second round. He's a little bit of a volatile player to project. So I'm interested to see where A.D. ends up.
Couple things here real quick, Ryan. I actually had him going 28 to the Bills in my little fun mock draft, which is another example of just the rich keep getting richer. Because if they can figure it out with that kid, with that arm, like to me, it's a perfect fit for Josh Adams. It's a dude, you only need to run 3 routes: post, goes, and overs, deep overs. Like that's it. And then let Josh just go to work. You know what I mean? And then I had my corner run starting at 13. Where do you see Cooper DeJean going in this draft? Like, where do you like? Do you have some teams in mind? I had him going 15 to the Colts.
Mm-hmm.
I heard the Colts. I've read that the Colts are looking for corners. I really like that kid's film. Where do you see him going?
My favorite fits with the Packers because the Packers need outside corner because Jair Alexander, his future is kind of up and down a little bit. They could also use a nickel and they could also use a safety. So Cooper DeJean is a guy that could play all of those things. He's really a rare player, not necessarily a rare grade. Like I'm not calling him a generational player, but you don't often get guys that could legitimately play outside corner, nickel, or safety. He could play all over the place. So he's a very rare football player. So Green Bay is an interesting one. And he's white. And he's white.
Not that. He can return kicks, return punts.
Oh, he's a great athlete.
Good punt returner.
He's a freak athlete, man. Go look at his track and field background.
Have you ever seen his high school basketball film?
I haven't seen the high school basketball film. I've seen the track and field numbers.
He's rising up two-hand, like cocking it back and banging on. He's only like 6'1". Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he was a freaky athlete. Freaky athlete. Ryan, we did have one super chat before you get out of here. And I didn't bring this up because I wanted a super chat to do it. Christopher Crosby asked, Ryan, Byron Murphy, or Jerzon Newton. I've seen some people call him Johnny Newton.
Yeah, he goes by Johnny.
I've been in arguments about it. I think Newton is the better player, and people look at me like I'm crazy. What say you?
I believe that Jerzon Newton is also a better football player than Byron Murphy. I think Byron Murphy is a little more flashy at times, but Jerzon Newton has been consistently dominant for Illinois the last 2 years. Both guys are actually kind of similar body types. They're a little bit sawed off and lower built to the ground, but I really like Jerzon Newton. The only thing about, and because predictive wise, Christopher, I would say that I think Byron Murphy is going to go before Jerzon Newton. I do believe it because there's actually some not character things around Jerzon, but there's some coachability things around Jerzon. So like that's one thing that's kind of working against him a little bit. And he's coming off an injury that cost him, the entirety of this draft process and a little bit of this past season. So things are holding Newton back, but I think Newton's a top 20 player in this class when healthy. And I think he could be a tremendous football player. I actually don't have a first round grade or actually anything even that. I have like a late second, I think, on Byron Murphy. He's one guy that I think is being overvalued way too much in this class.
I will leave you with this, Ryan. I saw some stuff that came out while you and I were first started on this that said that the Rams, there's a lot of people saying the Rams are calling teams in the top 10 trying to move up. Where do you see the Rams going if, in fact, they are trying to go up? Would it be tackle? Do you think a receiver? What are your thoughts?
Tackle or defensive line. Obviously, you have to replace Aaron Donald. Maybe they're moving up for a D tackle. I guess I would hate it if they're moving up for Byron Murphy.
I mean, it'd be the two guys
Byron Murphy
talked about, right? Like
it'd be Byron Murphy if they were going to move up, which I think would be a mistake. The other one would be edge. Maybe if a Jared Verse or Dallas Turner or somewhere around pick 10, maybe you move up there. The other spot is tackle.
Get like a Joe Alt, like something like that.
Maybe a Joe Alt. I think a tackle just in general, though. They need a true left tackle, so Alt would be on the short list. They don't need another right tackle. They have a pretty good right tackle, but I could see him moving up for someone like an Alt, or if they think an Amarius Mims could play left tackle, or an Ola Fashanu if they wanted to go that route.
Just since you're a Rams fan, Ryan, I did have the Rams staying at 19 and taking Newton. That's who I had in my mock draft.
I'd be great with that if that's what happened, but I just don't think it's going to happen, unfortunately. So
we'll
good. See.
Well, Ryan, I know you got to run. Thank you. Ryan and I will have some wrap up stuff here over the next couple of days as well. We'll have a I'm going to talk to Ryan about this because we're normally going to have a recruiting show tomorrow, but I'll talk to him. We may do some other things. We'll see. We'll see what we're going to do tomorrow, but we'll be back tomorrow. Going to be a lot of fun. Ryan obviously joining us talking NFL draft. You guys know he loves the NFL draft. So we're going to move on to some Notre Dame topics here about the draft, or I'm going to move on to those. But before we do, folks, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And as always, if you have not done so, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So part 3 of today's show, I'm going to have some fun. Well, it's actually not even actually that much fun because it's a little frustrating, but I'm going to kind of look at Notre Dame just kind of over the last 10 years and Notre Dame in the NFL draft on sort of a class-by-class basis, because when you look at Notre Dame and the Brian Kelly era, it really is a fascinating thing because there's a lot of good that came out of it, but there's also just a lot of frustration. And I want to have some fun kind of going through the different classes, talking about Notre Dame's draft success by class over the years, and then talk a little bit at the end about could we see this changing? And how will it change and where will it change? What positions have they been strong at and which ones they have not? So we're going to have some fun doing that. And I'm very curious to kind of get your guys' feedback on this. And I'm going to be open and honest about some of these things. I'm going to talk about a couple classes that I really thought were going to produce a lot of NFL players that were really bad, and some classes that maybe, maybe were a little bit better. So we'll dive into all that here as we get going. So I'm really looking forward to this, because the reality is the NFL draft is not necessarily indicative of college success completely, but it to me, there's something symbolic about it, where when you look at the teams that consistently win year after year after year, it's not a coincidence. They tend to be higher, put more out draft picks. What I would contend is you could actually put a lot of guys out in the NFL draft, but not actually be a team that's super successful, because you'll see teams put guys out and they have athletes, but they're maybe not overly successful because, they may not be coached well, or they may be, they tend to produce it at a lot at certain positions, but overall they may not be as strong. And so when you look at Notre Dame over the last 10 years, Notre Dame, if just kind of look at the rank, let me see here. I'm thinking that's not correct. Let me see here. When was that written? Those are first round picks. So yeah, if you look at Notre Dame over the last 10 years, Notre Dame has had 7 first round draft picks, which ranks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, tied for 11th with Florida State, Iowa, Oregon, and Texas A&M, behind Southern Cal, behind Louisville, behind Washington, behind Florida, behind Michigan. And so you've seen them not put out a lot of high-level NFL players. But what you have also seen is that Notre Dame ranks higher than that when it comes to overall draft picks, because they tend to put a lot more guys in the NFL draft, just not as many guys that are high-level picks. And that's something that I've found pretty fascinating over the last 10 years. So if you're going to say, well, what are some signs that Notre Dame is a program that's on the rise? It's going to be they start putting more and more guys in the NFL draft, but also more importantly, they start putting more guys in the higher levels, and so when you look at where Notre Dame has been, the lack of any kind of consistency putting perimeter edge defenders into the high level parts of the draft, that being corners and defensive ends. They have struggled to consistently put receivers into the higher parts of the NFL draft. You've had some guys here and there. You had the Golden Tate, Michael Floyd duo. You had Chase Claypool and Will Fuller and Miles Boykin, but there just hasn't been the consistency at those positions. And to me, that's very, very telling. And so we're going to have some fun kind of going through some of that stuff here as I dive into the draft. So where I'm looking at here, I mentioned to you guys, I'm going to talk about the last 10 years. And when you're talking about the last 10 years, it's looking at basically the last 10 years of where you're talking about where classes have completed their senior seasons. So like, I'm not going to talk about the 2021 draft class in part of this conversation. It'll be kind of more of a follow-up conversation. It's essentially 2011 to 2020. Those are the classes that have now finished their careers. And then even the 2020 class is questionable to discuss there, because there's a lot of guys in the 2020 class that are still in college for Notre Dame, partly because of COVID. But that's kind of part of the conversation as well. But when you go back through it, here's basically what Notre Dame has done in that period of time. So from 2011 to 2020, Notre Dame had 41 players get drafted in that 10-year stretch that were recruited by Notre Dame. There are, and I'll give them a little bit of an asterisk there, because I'm going to give him credit for Alohi Gilman, even though he was a transfer. I don't give him the same kind of credit for Ben Skoranek, because he was developed somewhere else. You just kind of brought him in as a one-year rental. Just like I won't say, if Notre Dame has Riley Leonard go in the first round next year, hypothetically, I won't be like, see, this answers all the questions about Notre Dame being able to recruit and develop quarterbacks, because it doesn't do that. But those still count. But these 41 players are guys that Notre Dame has signed from 2011 to 2020, and I only counted players that actually attended Notre Dame for any period of time. So I did not count Eddie Vanderdoes, for example. I did count Aaron Lynch as part of that. So let's go back through the years and look at Notre Dame's draft classes and the success that they had through the years. And it begins with 2011. Notre Dame had 5 players from its 2017 or 2011 class get drafted. The other thing is keep in mind that I only counted position players in this instance. So 29.4% of the 2011 draft class got drafted, which is actually a decent number for the numbers. They had 3 players go in round 2. That'd be Troy Nicholas at tight end, Stephon Tuitt at defensive end, and Nick Martin on the offensive line. They went all 3 went in the second round. Aaron Lynch was a 5th-round pick of the San Francisco 49ers, and Ben Koyak was a 7th-round pick of the Jacksonville Jaguars. The next year, Notre Dame only had 4 players from the next year's draft class get picked, which is 23.5%, which isn't nearly as good. You had Ronnie Stanley was a 1st-round draft pick. You had 2 third-round draft picks in C.J. Prosise and Kavari Russell, and then Sheldon Day was a 4th-round pick. So you actually had some decent day 1, day 2 type of production, but overall, those 2 classes were smaller and didn't have a lot of success. There were some guys that I felt in the 2011 class that should have been NFL players or could have been NFL players if things would have panned out. And it just kind of goes to show some of the lack of success they've had at developing players. DeVars Daniels, to me, should have been an NFL player if he would have been more coachable and worked harder. I still believe Matt Hegarty could have been an NFL player if not for the heart problems and the things that kind of stunted his growth and development a little bit. I thought Jarrett Grace could have been an NFL player if not for his devastating knee injury. Would he have been a high draft pick? No. I really thought Ishaq Williams was a guy that could have developed into an NFL player as well. Same with George Atkinson. Now, George Atkinson played in the NFL. The late George Atkinson played in the NFL, but he wasn't drafted. And that class also had Matthias Farley. So there was actually a couple guys from that draft class that spent some time in the NFL that weren't drafted. Another player that I thought was going to be a really good player in college that ended up not panning out at all is Ben Council. I really liked Ben Council coming out of high school as well. But that that recruiting class ended up being disappointing for me because there were several guys that I thought in that draft class that I thought were going to be NFL players. I really did from a talent standpoint. The next year was a little bit of a tougher year. You had a smaller class. You had some weird misses. I believe that was the Deontay Greenberry year where he left. Your receiver class was not that great. Justin Ferguson, Devontae Neal, Chris Brown. You had Will Mahone at running back, Gunnar Kiel at quarterback. Offensive line, you only had 2 guys, Mark Harrell, Ronnie Stanley. Jerron Jones is a guy that I thought could have been drafted if he was a little bit more mature. Romeo Okwara is an interesting guy from that class because obviously he ended up playing a long time in the NFL even though he wasn't drafted. But you can count that as a success, in my opinion. Even though it wasn't a player that was drafted, it was a player that obviously they identified and got that correct because Romeo went on to play almost, 8, 9, almost a decade, right? In the NFL, 8, 9 years before he retired because of injuries. 2013, this is an interesting one because this was by far Notre Dame's best recruiting class of the last 15 years. This was a class that finished 3rd. Even if you take Eddie Vanderdoes out of the equation, this is still a class to me that was loaded with players, absolutely loaded with players. But if you look at the NFL draft production, they had 2 first-round picks in that draft class, a second-round pick. So Will Fuller, Mike McGlinchey were first-round picks. Jalen Smith was a second-round pick. I think we can all agree that Jalen Smith was a first-round player at Notre Dame, but the injury kind of pushed him out. You had Durham Smythe going round 4, and you had Isaac Rochelle going round 7. Now, the interesting thing about that draft class is you had a couple guys from that draft class that I think would have been drafted if they would have stayed playing football that left, which hurt the draft class. Corey Robinson is one. I think Corey, if he would have stuck with football, would have been drafted. And then Steve Elmer's the other one. He's a guy that walked away from football and just chose not to play football, and I think that hurt his production as well. But you had some other guys that I thought were going to be NFL players in that class. It was overall a disappointing draft class, in my opinion. Torian Folson's injury hurt him. Greg Bryant's tragic situation hurt him. I mean, I thought both of those guys were going to be NFL players. I thought Torrey Hunter had a chance to be an NFL player. You look at the defensive side of the ball, I thought Cole Luke had a chance to be an NFL player. Max Redfield had a chance to be an NFL player. James Onwualu had a little bit of a cup of coffee in the NFL, but there was a lot of guys from that class that were very highly ranked that just didn't pan out the way that a lot of us thought that they were going to pan out. So if you actually look at it, even though it had more high-level success, so it had 3 first or second round picks, which is the same as the 2011 class as far as total, but there was more of a first round production here. From a percentage of the class standpoint, this class disappointed. It was not as good as far as producing from a volume standpoint. It produced, or from a percentage standpoint, produced more than the 2012 class, but there were 6 more players in that class. 2014 was another disappointing year for Notre Dame from a draft standpoint. You had 22 players signed in that class. Only 3 of those players ended up in the NFL. And this is when I started to really have some issues where I started to really kind of start going hard on Brian Kelly for some of the things that they were doing from a recruiting standpoint. If you go back and look at that class, Deshaun Kaiser was a second-round pick. Quentin Nelson was a first-round pick. Drew Trank was a fourth-round pick. I think to a degree, if we're being honest as well, you are going to kind of look at it and say, and when I say class, I'm referring to the recruiting class, by the way. So just keep that in mind. If I say draft class, we're talking about the draft. It's a misspeaking, but I'm talking about the recruiting class. You had some bad luck in that class as well. Yeah, I still say if Alex Bars doesn't tear his knee up, Alex Bars is going to get drafted. There's a couple other guys that kind of had some similar situations. But overall, the class was just a disappointing class when it signed, and it ended up being a disappointing class from producing NFL players. You had Justin Brent and Corey Holmes were your skill players in that year. They're just not high-level players. Offensive line class, Sam Mustipher didn't get drafted, but Sam Mustipher's still in the National Football League. You had Quentin Nelson was a high pick. Alex Bars would have been picked if he would have not been injured. Greer Martini and Niles Morgan both spent some time in the NFL. I really thought Niles Morgan was going to be an NFL player. You had the defensive line class, high on numbers. Johnny Williams shouldn't have been at a place like Notre Dame. Grant Blankenship didn't pan out. Jonathan Bonner, high motor kid, tough kid, just not a super talented kid. Daniel Cage, not an NFL player. Jay Hayes, Pete Makwa. And then the one guy that I think still should have been an NFL player, and if you talk to people around the team, they'll say early in his career, we all thought he was an NFL player, and that's Andrew Trembetti. He's one of those guys that I feel was completely wasted by Brian Van Gorder. I think Brian Van Gorder, this class and the 2013 class, had a couple guys that I think, had they had a real defensive coordinator, during that tenure would have been much better players. Cole Luke's one, and Andrew Trembetti's one. Are guys that I really felt like, and Niles Morgan's the other, that if they had a better coach, would have been guys that would have had NFL futures, in my opinion. But 2014, only 13.6% of that recruiting class got drafted, which was a little disappointing. Then you go into a stretch here in 2015 and 2016 where you had a couple classes that ended up producing some good players, especially the 2016 class, which was a little bit of a surprise. The 2015 class kind of falls in line with some of the others. You get into the 2015 class. Again, there were some injury situations that happened that prevented it from being as good as it could have been. That they had 5 players drafted in that class. Jerry Tillery was a first-round pick. Miles Boykin was a third-round pick. Equanimeous St. Brown and Dexter Williams were both 6th-round picks, and Alize Mack was a 7th-round pick. Now, Jalen Guyton got kicked out of school after a year. He spent a lot of time in the NFL. He's still in the NFL, but he didn't get drafted. Josh Adams' foot injury, I believe, hurt his chances of getting drafted. And then offensive line, you only signed Tristan Hodge and Trevor Rowland. Josh Barajas was a bust, a guy that I was very high on coming out. Osmar Bilal, not surprised how he was a solid player at Notre Dame, but not an NFL guy. Tavon Coney was a really good college football player, just not athletic enough for the NFL and had some other type of woes. But your defensive line class, you didn't sign a single defensive end, And after Jerry Tillery, for those of you that maybe not remember, for some of the younger people, Jerry Tillery committed to Notre Dame to play offensive line. He was recruited by Harry Hiestand. And when he played in the Army All-American game, he played left tackle. He decided really late in the process he wanted to play D-line. And part of that was LSU was trying to flip him, and that's what they were selling him on. But he was actually recruited by Harry Hiestand. The defensive line class in 2015, this is their entire defensive line class as far as who they recruited. It was Micah Treadway, Brandon Tiassum, and I'm losing it here, and Elijah Taylor. Now, I like those kids. I've talked to Brandon Tiassum a few times. Great kid, but like that can't be your entire defensive line class. It can't be. And there were some big misses. And then your secondary class had some bad luck. McKelty Williams not being admitted or getting in having some issues and having to go. Sean Crawford and all his injuries. I still think Sean had a chance to be an NFL player if he didn't have all the injuries he had. But then you had like Nico Fertitta, Ashton White, Nick Coleman. It just was a lot of settling at Notre Dame during that period of time. A lot of settling. And you see why the draft class only produced 21.7% of the players drafted. Now, the next year was one of Notre Dame's best draft classes in a long time, or like draft classes for a recruiting class in a very long time. Notre Dame had, in 2016, they signed 23 players in that period. 9 of them got drafted. That's 39.1%. So if you look at it and you look from 2011 to 2016, the previous high percentage was 29.4 in 2011. That was only a 17-man class. This recruiting class had 23 players in it and had 9 players get picked. You had Chase Claypool and Liam Eichenberg were second-round picks. Julian Ekwara was a third-round pick. Julian Love and Troy Pride were fourth-round picks. Ian Book was a fourth-round pick. And then Dalen Hayes, Adi Takumba Ogundeji, and Khalid Kareem were all fifth-round picks. And this draft class, I mean, this was a big hit. I mean, this draft class was a big hit. But even then, it was kind of part of my issue where you sign this great defensive end class, but you don't sign a single defensive tackle from that class. And the offensive line class, and here's the thing about that draft class too. If it wasn't for injuries, I think it's even better. And if it's not for some guys getting in trouble, if Kevin Stepherson doesn't have the trouble he has, I think he's a drafted player. If Javon McKinley doesn't have all the injuries he has, I think he's a draftable player. Tommy Kramer, without all the injuries, is a draftable player. Tommy Kramer has started games in the NFL, even though he was an undrafted player. And the reason he went undrafted is because he had all the injuries, but he's played in the NFL. So you had 9 players drafted. Plus, you have had Tony Jones has played games in the NFL. You have had Tommy Kramer has started games in the NFL. Jameer Jones has started games in the NFL. So even though you only had 9 guys picked, Dante Vaughn spent some time in the NFL. You had 9 guys that were drafted. 4 other guys from that class made an NFL roster at some point in time. So you're talking about 13 of your 23 players in that draft class spent time in the NFL, 2016 class. And that's 56.5% of your roster. And what did that class do? That class was part of 2 college football playoff teams. Not a coincidence. You want to win, recruit NFL talent. The 2016 class did that. The 2017 class was a very interesting recruiting class as well from a draft standpoint, because it was a smaller class. They had to throw some guys together at the end, so they had to take some guys late that maybe otherwise might not have been drafted. They had some guys that had some injury problems that I think kept them from being players. But you had Michael Young and Jafar Armstrong at receiver. You had Cole Kmet, Brock Wright at tight end, C.J. Holmes at running back, Avery Davis was your quarterback. You had a pretty good offensive line class. You got Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah late. You had some issues on the defensive line. I mean, they signed Jonathan McCollister and Kofi Wardlow. And so it ended up not being a great class from a draft standpoint, but it's actually had a pretty good NFL impact. So of the 20 position players that were drafted or that were signed, 4 of them got drafted. And so that's good for a 20% clip, which is not good. Here's the thing, though. They were all drafted high. Cole Kmet was a second-round pick. Aaron Banks was a second-round pick. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah was a second-round pick. And Robert Hainsey was a third-round pick. So there was some high-quality volume to that. But if you look at it, Brock Wright was part of that class, so he wasn't drafted. But he has just signed a, $4 or $5 million a year contract to the NFL. So Kurt Hinish was not drafted, but Kurt's has, I believe, started some games this past year for the Houston Texans. So there's at least a couple guys from that draft class to spend time in the NFL. And I still believe, again, Josh Lugg's another one that started multiple years, that has spent time on an NFL roster, that if not for injuries would have had a chance, in my opinion, to be a guy that spent a little bit more time in the NFL. So overall, disappointing draft class. But this is the issue with Brian Kelly, and this is something I've talked about all the time. You had that 2016 class that had all those NFL players in it. 39% of your players in that class were drafted. But the year before it, only 21%. And the year after it, only 20%. And then that brings us to what I feel was the class that I personally had the biggest. I've never missed more on a class in my life than the 2018 class. You guys are always asking, what were you wrong about? Well, this is one that I was wrong about. There were some holes in the class. There were some parts of the class that I didn't like. I didn't like the running back class, and it ended up not being very good with Jameer Smith and Sebo Flemister. I didn't love the offensive line class. Only one guy from that class started games. That's Jarrett Patterson. There were some other aspects of it I didn't like. It was thin on defensive line numbers, but there was other parts of this class that I really liked, and I thought were going to be NFL players. You had Phil Dracovic, a quarterback. Well, I'll get to that in a second, but only 2 players of the 27 guys that signed with that class, only 2 of them were drafted. That's it. Only 2. And that's 7.4%. And if you look at it, there's not a whole lot of other guys that even have spent a lot of serious time in the NFL, which I'll get to. Now, there's a chance that Jameon Franklin and DJ Brown make an NFL roster. Highly unlikely either get drafted. They're still in college. But you had Phil Dracovic, a quarterback. I thought he was going to be an NFL player. He didn't pan out. There was a time in his career after 2020 when he transferred to BC and what he did that year that you had people projecting him to be a first-round draft pick. And he completely flamed out, bombed out. Running back, no surprise there. I'm still surprised Kevin Austin was an NFL player. Not because, I thought he was going to get drafted high, but because of the decisions he made and different things that happened, he ruined his chance to be an NFL player. George Takis is a guy that I thought had NFL talent. And the only 2 that were picked, by the way, were Tommy Tremble in round 3 and Jarrett Patterson in round 6. That's it. The offensive line class, not a surprise. You got linebacker between Jack Lamb, Shane Simon, Bo Bauer, and Ovia Gofu. I thought at least 1 of the 2 of those guys would get drafted. I really did. Defensive line-wise, you had the Adamiola twins and Jameon Franklin. Safety, you had Houston Griffith and Derek Allen. Ryan and I were talking about this before the show. We both love Derek Allen coming out. Love Derek Allen. Now, I'm still shocked he didn't pan out. You had DJ Brown, Noah Boykin, Tariq Bracy, and Braden Lindsey. I thought those guys would be NFL players. And I still think that Braden could have been, if he wanted to stick with football and really had that passion for football. That's not a knock on him. If you don't have the passion for football, then don't keep trying to play it just to play it. I actually respect Braden's decision to walk away because he didn't love it. And he just wanted to do other things with his life, which I'm all for. But Tariq Bracy, Braden Lindsey are guys that you look at like, man, I thought those were going to be NFL players. Definitely had speed. So many busts in that class that I've never gotten a draft class or a recruiting class that wrong. And not even just, okay, the guy didn't pan out in the NFL, but just didn't pan out in college. Kevin Austin had 1 nice year at Notre Dame, but I thought that'd have been like his sophomore year as he gets ready to break out. I've never missed bigger on a class. So you look at a 4-year stretch at Notre Dame where you're just not hitting on numbers. And that really kind of sank them a little bit. The 2019 class is going to be interesting because that is still a very incomplete class because of COVID. And you had 22 players from that draft class, that recruiting class. Dang it. You have only had 2 players or 3 players from that group of 22, or actually 21 have been drafted. So that's obviously not a very high percentage. So if you look at it right now, you're thinking, well, 2019 class, you only had 14.3% of your players get picked. That's going to change quite a bit. The 2019 class, and Ryan and I were just talking about this, the 2019 class has a chance, even though it doesn't look like it now, to be one of Notre Dame's most productive draft, like recruiting classes from a draft standpoint. When you look at Notre Dame and you look at that class, you've got the 3 guys that were drafted. Okay, you've got, let me pull this back up, 2019 class. You had Kyle Hamilton was picked, taken in round 1. Isaiah Foskey was taken in round 2, and Kyron Williams was taken in round 5. 2 of those 3 guys are already hits in the NFL, which is important. Foskey, we'll see. But that draft class is going to have at least 2 more guys from that draft class from that recruiting class get drafted. I'm going to keep saying that, and I apologize. I'm trying not to, but it's just we're talking draft. 2 more guys from that recruiting class are definitely going to get drafted. Cam Hart's in that recruiting class. Marist Liufau is in that recruiting class, and J.D. Bertrand's in that recruiting class. If Ryan's mock draft turns out to be correct, that's 6 guys from that draft class that recruiting class that got picked, which ups the numbers. That would then jump it up to 28.6%, which would be the 3rd best of the last decade. But that's not all. Howard Cross and Jack Kaiser are also both from that recruiting class. If they both go on to get drafted next year, then now all of a sudden we're talking about that draft class or that recruiting class being 38.1%, which would be the 2nd best recruiting class from an NFL producing NFL talent standpoint that Brian Kelly had during his tenure. And so that would be a class that obviously could produce it. And then, of course, there's like Zeke Correll and Quinn Carroll, who also are going to be in college next year. Those are 2 guys going in their 6 years that could maybe get drafted. I don't really see either one of those guys getting drafted as of right now. Zeke Correll probably have a better shot than Quinn Carroll because of the Harry Hiestand connection if he's able to have a really good year at NC State this season. So you're talking about that class having potentially 7 or 8 total players picked. And what's interesting is a lot of those guys that are going to get picked were the lowest ranked guys in the class. So you look at, I'm just going to look at the Rivals rankings, for example, and you look at you had Cam Hart was their 2nd lowest ranked position player in that draft class. They had him as a mid-level 3-star player. J.D. Bertrand was a 3-star. Marist Liufau was a 3-star. Kyron Williams was a 3-star. Jack Kaiser was a 3-star. They had Isaiah Foskey as a 4-star, but they had Isaiah Foskey ranked as not even as the top 250 player. So he obviously outplayed his draft class. They had Howard Cross ranked as a 4-star player, but he was not ranked in the top 250 either. So you're talking about 2 guys that ended up being really good players. And the highest ranked guy in that class was Quinn Carroll, who I also liked a lot coming out, but he's another guy that had some injuries and really lost a lot of athleticism. So yes, Roger Dodger, if you drink your coffee every time I say draft instead of recruiting, you are going to be super, super, super wired because you're going to be drinking a lot of coffee, my friend. I'm just letting you know that right now. A couple guys that I thought could have been NFL players from that draft, from that recruiting class is Howard Cross. Is Jacob Lacey and Hunter Spears that I think would have had chances to be drafted if not for injuries. I think both of those guys are really, really good football players. But obviously things didn't pan out for them. So that class has a chance to be a really, really loaded class. Another class, recruiting class, got that one, that has a chance to have a very high hit rate is the 2020 class. And this is the last class that we're going to look at from this period of time. Because as of right now, that recruiting class only had 17 players in it. One of them has been drafted so far. That's it. Michael Mayer. You have a chance to have some other guys picked, but I think ultimately that class is going to turn out to be a disappointment overall. Now, Xavier Watts is in that draft class. I think he's going to get a recruiting class. He's going to get picked, I think, as a day 1, day 2 guy. Riley Mills was in that recruiting class. Chris Tyree was in that recruiting class. Jordan Patelho was in that recruiting class. They're all guys that have a chance to be drafted. Obviously, the last 2, Tyree and Patelho, are a little bit lower on that board, but the top 2 guys are. But if only those 2 guys get picked, then you're talking about a draft class that ended up not being a very big success. And then you look forward to you look ahead to actually that only had 6. There was only 16 guys in that draft class. Alec Peitz was the 17th guy in that class. He was a snapper. So as of right now, you're looking at potentially an 18.8% draft class. But if, Clarence Lewis and Chris Tyree, Tosh Baker, Jordan Patelho, all those guys all of a sudden have big years and all, end up going to get drafted, it could jump that class way up. I don't think it's going to happen. And if a lot of those guys do get drafted, it would be day 3 guys, day 2, day 3, day 2 maybe for Tyree, day 3 for everybody else. Now, the interesting class for me is the 2021 class, because that's a class that's going to surpass some of these other classes this weekend. So you talk about the 2020 class only has one guy drafted so far and there won't be any from that class drafted this year because none of them are going to be drafted. They're still in college. The 2019 class could end up adding several guys to it. The 2018 class isn't going to add anybody to it. So when you look at that class, you've got 3 guys that are likely to get drafted from that class tonight or this weekend. You have Audric Estimé was part of that class. He's going to get drafted. You have Blake Fish was part of that class, and Joe Walt was part of that class. Now, that was a big class. It was a 26-man class of skill players. And there's a lot of guys that already we know aren't going to be drafted players. Kane Barong's not going to get drafted. Tyler Buckner's not going to get drafted. Ron Paulus isn't going to get drafted. Highly unlikely that Pat Coogan gets drafted. Caleb Johnson probably won't get drafted. You've got, let's go down. Will Schweitzer's already retired from football. Devin Upow's not going to get drafted. Justin Walter's not going to get drafted. Ryan Barnes is going to get drafted. Chance Tucker's not going to get drafted. Philip Riley's not going to get drafted. JoJo Johnson's not going to get drafted. And Kerry G's not going to get drafted. So a lot of those guys we know. But then there's some other guys. What happens to Lorenzo Styles? Does Deion Colesy kind of have the light go on? Can he work himself his way into the NFL draft? Mitchell Evans is another guy that if he can be healthy, probably gets drafted. Can Logan Diggs pass background checks or not background checks, but injury checks, like medical checks? And, does he have a chance to get drafted? You look at the offensive line, Pat Coogan, could he maybe work himself into it? Highly unlikely. Could Rocco Spindler work himself into a draftable player? Gabriel Rubio has a chance to be a draftable player. Jason Onye has a chance to be a draftable player. So there's still some guys that have a chance to turn out and be draftable players. Jaden Thomas maybe is that guy that can be healthy. So there's several guys to me that have a chance to get drafted to where this 2021 class could end up being a pretty solid number total, but the percentage is still going to be low. Now we get into moving forward. Does this trend start to change? Because I want some feedback from you guys. When I go through those numbers, 5 guys from 2011, 4 from 2012, 5 from 2013, 3 from 2014, 5 from 2015, 9 from 2016, 4 from 17, 2 from 18, let's say 7 from 19, and let's say 4 from 20. And let's say 6 or 7 from 2021. When you look at that, there's some good years there, but it's just not the kind of success that you need to have if you're going to go out there and compete for championships. You just need more high-level talent. And even if you say, well, they had some injuries this one year and this other year, and you can say, okay, I buy all that. I mean, that's fine. They had some injuries, but everybody has to deal with that. Everybody has players that they lose and has to deal with guys not panning out. And that's just something where Notre Dame's going to have to find some answers, and they're just going to have to start producing more NFL players and more high-level NFL players because they just haven't done it. I mean, there's years where Ohio State didn't produce tons of numbers, but they were high-level players. But, just here's an example of a year I just picked a random year from Ohio State. Let's go 2017. They signed 21 players. J.K. Dobbins got drafted. Josh Myers got drafted. Wyatt Davis got drafted. Baron Browning got drafted. Pete Werner got drafted. Chase Young got drafted. And Jeffrey Okudah got drafted. Did Kendall Sheffield get drafted? I know he transferred. Does anybody remember if Kendall Sheffield got drafted? I honestly can't remember. I don't think that he got drafted. Yeah, he got drafted. He transferred, he got drafted. And then another guy was Sean Wade. Did Sean Wade get drafted? I believe Sean Wade got drafted as well, correct? Yeah, so Sean Wade was another guy that was drafted in the 5th round. So that class you had J.K. Dobbins, Josh Myers, Wyatt Davis, Baron Browning, Pete Werner, Chase Young, Sean Wade, Jeffrey Okudah, Kendall Sheffield. You had 9 of 21 players got drafted in that draft. Actually, 9 of 20 because they only had 20 position players. 9 of 20 guys got drafted that year. I just picked a random class. That's 45%. That's better than any draft class that Notre Dame has had. Let's just go to the previous year, 2016, which was Notre Dame's best draft class. Had 9 out of 23 guys get drafted. Ohio State that year had, 25 commitments. One was a kicker who actually, I have to look, Buckeye fans have to tell me, didn't Drew Chrisman, did he get drafted? I can't remember if he got drafted or not. But let's look at the Buckeyes from their 2016 class, which was Notre Dame's best class, and see how that stacks up. And again, we're talking about a team that has been considered a consistent top 5 football team. So that class, Austin Mack, I do not believe got drafted. You had Benjamin Victor, Jake Houseman. I don't think he was drafted. You had Luke Farrell was drafted, so that's 1. You had, let me just kind of go through here real quick and kind of go through this class. So you had DeMario McCall was not drafted. Antonio Williams was not drafted. Dwayne Haskins was drafted. Jack Wallaball was not drafted. Michael Jordan was drafted. That's 3. Gavin Cupp was not drafted. You had Malcolm Pridgeon was not drafted. Tuff Borland was not drafted. Keandre Jones was not drafted. I'm going to look this up here and see if Drew Chrisman was drafted or not. It does not look like he did get drafted. So you had Malik Barrow was not drafted. I don't believe he was drafted. Nope, he was not drafted. Yeah, Jonathan Cooper was drafted. You had Nick Bosa was taken number 1 overall. You had Trey Avery was not drafted. Jordan Fuller was drafted. You had Malik Harrison was drafted. So this is one of Ohio State's, and the reason I pulled this up is because I knew this is one of their lower classes. But you look at that class, and let me just you had, and I don't believe Benjamin Victor was drafted either. So you had, 1. So Luke Farrell, Dwayne Haskins, Michael Jordan, Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bosa, Jordan Fuller, Malik Harrison, 7. That was one of Ohio State's least successful draft class. You had 7. Notre Dame recruiting class for the draft, Notre Dame had 1 class that produced more than that. That's it. That 2016 class for Notre Dame produced more than that. So that's kind of my point is and I just picked Ohio State. I didn't cheat and go to Bama. But you can go down the line and it's the same thing. It's going to be every year. You're just going to see more of these guys getting picked every year. And if you're talking about guys that did, we talked about counting Aaron Lynch. Well, you've got the 2015 class for Ohio State, and they had Joe Burrow in it. So you had KJ Hill got drafted, Mike Weber. I think Mike Weber got drafted, didn't he? Mike Weber got drafted. Joe Burrow got drafted. You had, let's see here. I forgot that they signed Mirko Jerkovic. I think Isaiah Prince got drafted, I believe. He got drafted. Yep, that's another one. Jerome Baker got drafted. Davon Hamilton, I'm pretty sure, got drafted. Draymond Jones got drafted. Did Sean Cornell get drafted? He got drafted. It's just slow to Denzel Ward, Damon Arnett. So if Notre Dame wants to get to that point, you've got to start seeing more guys get drafted. You have to get there. You have to start getting to the point where you're going to have high numbers of draft classes where you're consistently putting, 40+% of your guys in the draft. That's if you want to say, how does it correlate from success to the NFL? For me, for Notre Dame, you're going to need to get around that 40% mark on a regular basis and have some classes that are closer to 50. That's just kind of where you have to be. And when you look at Notre Dame's classes, man, it's been disappointing. So you guys all nice and depressed now, okay? But here's where I'm excited about it, because when you start looking forward and you start thinking about where they're going to be moving forward, we talked about this. The 2019 class is going to be a much bigger number, and that class has played a role. You look at the 2022 class and what that class has a chance to be. Eli Raridan and Holden Stace both have a chance to get drafted. Jadarian Price has a chance to get drafted. Ashton Craig has a chance to get drafted. Billy Schrouth has a chance to get drafted. We'll see about Emil Wagner. I'm not going to put him in there yet, but if he can win a job. Josh Burnham's got a chance to get drafted someday. Jalen Snead's got a chance to get drafted someday. Jaden Mickey's got to get has a chance to get drafted someday, and that's Benjamin Morrison has a chance to get drafted someday. So even if you just take, I'm not even talking, just take away guys that have transferred. Tobias Merriweather, Holden Stace. You've got Eli Raridan, Jadarian Price, Ashton Craig, Billy Schrouth, Emil Wagner, Josh Burnham, Jalen Snead. I probably should have Donovan Heinisch in there, Jaden Mickey, and Benjamin Morrison. That starts to move the needle because not all those guys are going to get picked. But that starts to move the needle. Now you start talking about, 7 to 8 of a 22-man class, maybe get up to 9 of a 22-man. Actually, it was a 21-man class. So now you start creeping up more towards that 40%. And this is where the 23 and 24 classes become so huge because we're talking about freshmen, right? And so, and by the way, that 7 to 8 of 21 is just the guys that stayed at Notre Dame. If Holden Stace and Tobias Merriweather, especially Holden Stace, are able to kind of go somewhere else to get drafted, then we're going to be we're going to be cooking a little bit when you start talking about that. And then let's look at the 23 class. You've got Jaden Greathouse, KK Smith, Braylon James, Cooper Flanagan, Jeremiah Love, Kenny Minchie, Sam Pendleton, Sullivan Absher, Charles Jagasaw, Christopher Tarrick, Drake Bowen, Jaden Alsbury, Boubacar Traore, Don Schuler, Christian Gray. There's some guys in that draft class. You're like, they have a chance to get there. But this is where it's key for Notre Dame. In the 24 class, same type of story. CJ Carr, Kedron Young, Aeneas Williams, Cam Williams, Micah Gilbert, Jack Larson, the freshman offensive line class. Gerby Lambert is a guy that you look at in that regard. And it just go down the list. There's a lot of that talent. But we could have had the same conversation with a lot of guys in the past. But what I'll say is this. When I look at the recruiting classes that Marcus Freeman has brought in, and I've heard people make this case, and it's kind of interesting when I hear it. I've heard people say, especially the Kelly apologists, well, Driscoll said that Marcus Freeman was going to recruit a lot better than Brian Kelly, and he hasn't because their average ranking is around whatever. And the point that I've made out, and the thing that I've pointed out when I have these conversations with people, is you have to stop looking at where they rank and look at the overall numbers in the class and the ability to get to certain levels. And the thing that I've pointed out is you can focus on 8th, 9th, 10th, or 11th, and I'm going to focus on the points. And since 2010 or 11, when we started all this, there's only been one draft class or one recruiting class that has had more points or a higher per player average than all three of the classes Marcus Freeman was a part of, 22, 23, and 24. That was the 2013 class. And points are basically determined by the number of players you sign, where they're ranked, and those type of things. But if you look at Notre Dame's last two classes, they're not big classes. They signed a 23-man class in 2023, and they signed a 23-man class in 2024. And those are not huge classes. And I think the 23 class, I believe, had a specialist. No, that was McPherson was in the 2022 class. So you signed 23 players each of the last 2 years. 23 players. And you look at it, more points, more higher per player average in a year where you didn't sign a higher number of players. 2013, 23-man class, 14 was 22, 23, 23, 20, 27, 21. It's on par size-wise with a lot of those classes. But the points were significantly higher for them in those classes than what we saw before. And, and that's the thing where you look at Marcus Freeman. I don't know how you can deny that he's bringing in a higher quality of recruit than we've seen in past years. I mean, you look at last year's recruiting class, the 2024 class, for example, had, according to Rivals, had 2,529 points, total points. And that's based on, like, if you rank in this area, you get a certain amount of points. If you're a 4-star, 5.9, whatever, you get a certain amount of points. And the average ranking was 3.83 average star ranking. If you look at the blue chip ratio, significantly higher 23 and 24 than past years. The 2023 class for Notre Dame ranked 11th in the country, 2,504 points, and had a 3.83 per player average. Let's go to the 2022 class, which Marcus Freeman had a big role in putting together. That Notre Dame class finished 6th. It had 2,481 points and 3.73 per player average. So a higher per player average and more points than the 22 class, which ranked 6th in the country that year, and they ranked 9th and 11th in those two previous years. 2021, Notre Dame had 2,378 points and 3.44 per player average. That was a 27-man class. So that it ranked higher than the 2023 class, which ranked 11th, but it had more points. The 2023 class had more points, way higher per player average. 2020 for Notre Dame, they ranked 22nd. They had 1,975 points, a 3.59 per player average. So far, that's the highest per player average, 3.59. The 2019 class, which has a chance to have 8 or 9 guys drafted, finished that season with 2,274 points and a 3.55 per player ranking. 2018, that was that big class in 2018 that I liked quite a bit. 2,380 points, only a 3.44 per player average. 2017, Notre Dame's recruiting class that year had 2,144 points and only a 3.33 per player average. Now, they had some very underrated players in that class that others had higher. I had higher, like Jeremiah Usu-Koromoa. 2016, that class that produced 9 NFL players, 2,289 points, 3.57 per player average. So I'm going to take that, and you look at that class, that was the best draft class Notre Dame had. 9 of their 23 players were drafted. 39%, best that they've had in a long time. And you compare it just from a recruiting ranking standpoint, 2,289 points, 23 players signed. Notre Dame's last 2 classes with 23 players signed, 2,529 points, 2,504 points, both year 3.83 per player average, which is significantly higher. If you want to get a glimpse of it, that 2016 Alabama class that ranked number 1 had a 3.83 per player average. Just keep that in mind. 2015, similar. It's going to be the same story every year. You guys get the point. Notre Dame, 2,423 points, 24-man class, 3.54 per player average. 2014, Notre Dame that year, 2,211 total points, 3.52 per player average. 2013, that was the great class that they had, 2,893 points, 3.92 per player average. That falls a little bit if you look at how that class would have ranked. It falls a little bit when you take out Eddie Vanderdoes because he was a 5-star guy. So if you actually take out Eddie and you divide it by the number, it would have been 3.87, which is very much closer on par with what Notre Dame did the last 2 years. 2012, Notre Dame's class had 1,521 points, 3.53 per player average. And the 2011 class, that season, Notre Dame had 1,976 points and a 3.48 player average. So what you're seeing when you look at it from year to year to year, the reason that those numbers are higher is not because Notre Dame has ramped up the number of 5-stars that they've signed. It's actually the opposite. Notre Dame's 2011 class had 2 5-stars in it, and one guy that was a borderline 5-star because you had 2 of the 5-stars were the defensive ends because you had Ishaq Williams was a 5-star, Stephon Tuitt was a 5-star, and Aaron Lynch was just outside of being a 5-star. He ranked 28th nationally. But you look at that class, more 5-star players. The 2013 class had 3 5-star players in it with a very similar average. And so when you go over the years and you say, you look at these Notre Dame classes, 1 5-star in 2014, and then you look at the last 2 classes, the 24 class for Notre Dame had 1 5-star player in it from rivals. And then the 2023 class by Notre Dame had 0 5-star players in it. So how can you have fewer of those players, but then have a significantly higher ranking, because what Notre Dame is doing, and they're doing a good job of, is they're doing a much better job of, they're still bringing in a similar quality at the top, but they're bringing in so much better depth. And the better depth is what's going to separate you from having a 4 or 5 man, recruiting class that goes to get drafted and 9, 10 type of guys. And that's what you're seeing them bring in. Now they've got to develop it. And that's where I think I'm excited, because I'm seeing trends towards them developing these players better, but they're also recruiting, in my opinion, higher level recruits at skill positions. Because some of the numbers that when you look at the past and you look at the positions, for example, it can get a little bit disappointing. So in those 10 recruiting classes, Notre Dame had just 3 cornerbacks get drafted out of those recruiting classes, just 2 defensive tackles, only 3 linebackers, 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 1 safety, 4 wide receivers. That's it. That's it. So again, what did I say? You're not doing well enough on the perimeter. Alabama had a wide receiver class in 2017 that had 3 receivers get drafted in the first round from that class alone. That was the Devontae Smith, Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs class. Notre Dame from 2011 to 2020 only had 4 receivers drafted, period. I don't know about you guys, but when I look at recruiting the last couple of years, I'm seeing the potential for Notre Dame to have 4 drafted players at receiver just from what's on the current roster of guys that they've recruited. So that's the reality of it, is you're seeing higher level players, higher level skill players. You guys saw me point out that Notre Dame had 3 corners from 2011 to 2020. 3 corners got drafted. Kavari Russell in round 3, Julian Love in round 4, Troy Pride in round 4. We may look back at the 2023 football team and say that Notre Dame had 4 drafted corners on that team alone. Cam Hart's going to probably get drafted. Benjamin Morrison's probably going to get drafted. I don't see any reason why Christian Gray's not on track to get drafted. And Jaden Mickey is a kid that I think is going to go get drafted. That's what I'm talking about. That's where things are changing, because you're seeing more of that kind of talent. Notre Dame from 2011 to 2020 had 3 running backs get drafted. One of those running backs was recruited to play safety. And the same thing with corner. 3 of the 3 corners that got drafted, one of them was recruited to play running back. That was Kavari Russell. And then you're going to have another corner that gets drafted this weekend for Notre Dame that was recruited to play receiver. Now you're seeing guys get drafted to play those positions. But you had 3 running backs get drafted, one of which had never played running back in his life until his senior year at Notre Dame in CJ Prosise. Of the running backs from 11 to 20 that were recruited to play running back, that stayed at running back, only 2 of them got drafted, a 5th-round pick and a 6th-round pick. When I look at Notre Dame's roster in 2023, I see 3 running backs that I think have a really good chance to get drafted. Audric Estimé, Jeremiah Love, and Jadarian Price. When I look at the 24 roster, I think that number grows because you brought in 2 potential NFL draft picks in Keidron Young and Aeneas Williams. So that's really the difference, is you're bringing in more and more skill. You're bringing in deeper classes. You're bringing in classes that you say, hey, boy, that 2011 class, I'll take that 5 against any top 5 anywhere else. But then I'm like, yeah, but I'll take 6 through 15 in the more recent classes. And that's the difference. Is one of the issues that I would complain about during the Kelly era was inconsistency year to year. Great year one year, bad year the next. We're not seeing that at Notre Dame right now under Marcus Freeman. You're not seeing them just completely striking out at positions, years where they didn't sign a single corner, single defensive end, single defensive tackle. How do you go through an entire recruiting cycle and don't land a single defensive end? How do you go through an entire recruiting cycle and not sign a single defensive tackle or a single safety or a single cornerback? That happened constantly in the Brian Kelly era. And those are the differences and why I'm excited about the future of the program, but also why I think coming up, you're going to see a lot more success in the NFL draft. I was asked about this yesterday in the buy, sell, hold. next year's draft class is going to be higher than this one. Well, Ryan predicted 7 guys get drafted this year. That'll be the second biggest draft class for Notre Dame since in the last 10 years, right? And we looked at this. I think the 2006, what would it be? Actually, no, it'd be third highest. So let me just pull this up so you guys know I like to give accurate information. So Notre Dame has 7. So 2021 had 9. 2020 had 6. 2019 had 6. 2016 had 7. 2014 had 8. 2013 had 6. So it's going to be one of their bigger classes. And then you look forward to next year. And you talk about the potential for Riley Leonard to be drafted. You talk about the potential for Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins to be drafted. They talk about the potential for Mitchell Evans to get drafted, Riley Mills, Howard Cross, Jordan Patojo, Jack Kaiser, Benjamin Morrison, Xavier Watts. You're now all of a sudden talking about, okay, there's a lot more NFL talent on this roster. Then you look ahead and you think about, who's coming up, guys that aren't necessarily draft eligible. Charles Jagasol, Billy Shrout is a potential NFL player. Ashton Craig's a potential NFL player. Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, Cam Williams, Micah Gilbert, KK Smith, Jaden Greathouse, Eli Raridan. You start getting more and more excited because the talent is there. The question is, can they develop that talent? And that's where I'm kind of fired up. So when you look at Notre Dame through the years, it was kind of sad putting that together, to be honest with you. When you just look at like, man, I thought that guy could have been an NFL player. I thought that guy could have been an NFL player. But then you look at the class, Gerby Lambert's another one, Jason Smith, absolutely. Sullivan Absher, Sam Pendleton. There's a lot of guys like that. But when I look at the classes now, I see more speed. I see more size. I see more length. I see wider margins for error with some of these guys. And I start getting excited about where Notre Dame is going. So I did all that depressing talk, and I think I depressed some people out of the chat because we had our numbers drop while I started reading the numbers, and maybe for some people it's boring, but I think part of it is kind of a bummer when you go through the years and you're like, dude, that class only had 2 guys get drafted. That class only had 4 guys get drafted. But the exciting thing is we're seeing more and more of that coming down the pike, and not just from portal guys. I mean, like next year's class success will have a lot of portal impact to it. But then you start getting into the 26 draft class, and now you're starting to talk about much higher numbers of guys that Notre Dame recruited and then developed. And that's what gets me excited. So even though it's been a bit of a disappointment, and it shows, hey, Notre Dame's been good, but not good enough. They're a top 10 team in total draft picks the last 10 years. That's pretty good, but you're way far away from the Georgias, the Bamas, the Ohio States. I think Notre Dame this past year was like 5th or 6th in total number of NFL players on a roster. That's starting to get better. More Pro Bowl players is starting to get better. So we're seeing that production be better. But they've got a chance these next few years to really take it to another level with on-field success, because that's a big part. A big part of it. But then also just recruit better athletes, recruit better talent, recruit bigger players, and Marcus Freeman's doing that. So it didn't end great, or didn't go great the previous 10 years, but I believe it's trending, and I'm looking forward to these next couple years of going back and looking at the numbers and seeing if it really plays out that way. And of course, they're going to have another first-round draft pick put on there tonight, which is something I'm excited about. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. I know that sometimes the numbers can get a little bit, overwhelming for people, but I just think it was really important to kind of go through that to show where things kind of faltered at Notre Dame and the misses and the disappointments, but then also kind of talk about how I do believe things are trending in the right direction. I think we have a lot more 2016 type of NFL classes coming down the pike here for Notre Dame than we have had some of the other classes. And, it's an exciting time to be a fan, in my opinion, if you're a Notre Dame fan. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. So head to the message board, folks, boards@irishbreakdown.com. Check out the stuff we've got going on there. A lot of fun stuff going on the chat. Going to have the gold. I didn't get a chance. I had some stuff came up around my house and my family yesterday, so I didn't get a chance to have the gold article written, but I do have the shell done. I've got all the grades done for the gold. I think some of you are going to be surprised a little bit by the numbers that I have for the gold blocking. And it's going to be interesting to discuss to have that. So you can find that at boards.archbreakdown.com. On the way out, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. We greatly, greatly appreciate that. Indy Milton fan, they've had 2 quarterbacks in the last 10 years, Ian Book and Deshaun Kaiser, just to answer your question on that one. We'll be back tomorrow, probably have a little recruiting talk, definitely talk some draft stuff. I got to get with Ryan and Sean and kind of figure out specifically what we're going to have to talk about tomorrow. But it's going to be a lot of fun. We'll have some analysis on the boards of the draft picks, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's definitely check those out. You can find all that at boards.archbreakdown.com. Have an awesome rest of your day, folks. 6 o'clock, IB Nation Sports Talk. You're not going to miss it. Guys are going to have a lot of fun stuff to talk about as well. And I'll see you all again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.